Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
The clock on the dashboard of Ethan's sports car read 3:51 p.m. Sunset was less than an hour away if his math held up. He knew he could have easily made it home before dark on any other day. Given this year's extraordinary level of inner-city holiday traffic, however, he was not sure how long the journey would take. The 5-day-long out-of-state work conference, followed by what had so far been nearly 3 hours of driving through a blinding snowfall, had left Ethan feeling exhausted. At that moment, however, he felt no need for rest. His heart rate was up, and there was a flutter of nervous excitement in his gut. And all he cared about was making it home to his daughters for Christmas Eve. Ethan's ears rang with the constant blare of car horns and hoarse shouts of trapped motorists. The city, which in any other year would have been bedazzled by elaborate displays of Christmas lights, had taken on a bleak and gloomy appearance. The death of his wife, earlier that summer, and the lack of holiday displays had left Ethan with an unshakable feeling of despair, as if the entire world was slipping into darkness. At that point, all that mattered to Ethan was making it home before the sun set. He had spent so many nights attempting to bury his grief in his work, leaving his daughters to handle the loss of their mother on their own. There was nothing he could do now to get back that lost time, but he sure as hell was not going to let them be alone that Christmas Eve. He decided to try to make another effort to call his eldest daughter, Madison. He had spoken to her shortly after he had crossed the state line, but he had tried twice since then, and his calls had gone straight to voicemail. His fingers shook as he selected her from his list of contacts, and he was relieved when the line started ringing. The windshield wipers droned on steadily, dutifully clearing away the barrage of falling snowflakes as he listened to the sound of his daughter's phone ringing. The fifth ring was interrupted by the sound of a 13-year-old girl's voice.
Dad?
Madison? Are you all right?
Yes, we're fine. We heard some commotion a couple hours ago. It sounded like the neighbors down the hall were fighting. But everything's been quiet since then.
And Hannah?
I think she's good.
It seemed to Ethan that he picked up on a slight hesitation.
She's not said much. I tried to get her to watch a movie with me, but she lost interest. I think she's just scared. I cleaned out the bathroom. I took out your razor and everything I could imagine being used as a weapon. There's nothing in there that she could hurt herself or anyone else with if it comes to it.
When you say that she hasn't said much, Ethan pressed her, his tongue feeling dry and awkward as he forced the words out. Do you mean to say that she's becoming unresponsive?
No, nothing like that.
Madison replied earnestly.
She still answers questions when I ask them. Her answers are usually short, but like I said, I don't think she's sick. I think she's just scared. I don't want to lock her in there yet, Dad. Maybe she won't get sick, you know? I know what they're saying on the news, but how could they really know anyway?
Ethan wanted to reassure his daughter. He wanted to tell her that yes, there was a good chance that there were 8-year-old children out there that had been spared. The news was saying that the sickness was taking all of the world's preteen children. But could they really know that for sure? He wanted to believe that they were wrong. He wanted to hold on to that hope.
In any case,
Madison broke the silence.
Nothing's supposed to happen before nightfall. That's what they're still saying, right?
That's what they said, Ethan agreed. Still, I want you to keep a close eye on her. If she does anything that seems out of sorts, if she gives you any reason at all to doubt her, I want you to put her in the bathroom. I know it's going to be hard on her, being locked up before anything happens, but I'd rather you do it while she's still lucid than have it get to the point where you have to resort to violence. We still don't know what this is. It could run its course in a few days. Hannah might be okay when all of this is over.
I'll be careful.
Then, in a choked voice, she added,
Hannah wanted me to ask, when are you coming home? The sun's gonna set soon, and she's worried that you might not make it back before she...
Her voice trailed off. Ethan blinked back against the tears in his eyes, took a deep breath, and attempted to compose himself. I'm only about 3 miles away. Tell her that. I'm telling you, though, that traffic is barely moving. I'm still hoping to make it back before anything happens, but if I don't make it and you start to feel like something is off with your sister, don't wait for me.
I'll tell her you'll be back soon.
Madison replied in a whisper.
Please hurry.
I'll call when I'm close, Ethan promised. A prolonged silence hung over them, during which it seemed neither of them could find anything else to say. The silence was broken by a dull beeping sound, indicating that Madison had hung up her phone. Ethan let out a deep, trembling exhalation and gripped the steering wheel tightly. The clouds in the distance were shimmering with the reflected orange glow of burning buildings. A string of looters ran across traffic a few cars ahead of him, but the sporadically placed first responders and members of the National Guard no longer seemed to care. Their sole purpose had become making preparations for what was coming when the sickness began to take hold of the city's children. The first reports of the virus, if it really was a virus, had come out of England. Cryptic, contradictory reports of missing children, mass hysteria, and riots. As more details came in, it was suggested that children under the age of 12 had been murdering their parents, congregating in the streets, and attempting to overwhelm members of law enforcement. Within that same hour, similar reports began to come out of Spain and Ireland, describing their children with terms such as bloodthirsty, rabid, and impervious to threats or pain. Over the next 4 hours, the sickness had spread westward, keeping pace with the setting of the sun, infecting Greenland, South America, and the east coast of the United States. As soon as the news reported that it had lost contact with their correspondent in Perry, Maine, Ethan and most of his colleagues had abandoned the conference and started out for their homes, racing against the setting sun. Some of his co-workers, Ethan knew, had flown in from the East Coast. Now that air traffic over the United States had been grounded, many of his colleagues had been forced to leave the conference in rental cars. It would take them days to get home, if they made it back at all. By the sound of the news reports, Ethan doubted if they ever would. Ethan had decorated the apartment lightly for the holidays that year. The Christmas season had always been an important time for his wife, Joy. Every year, she had overseen an elaborate redecorating of their home, complete with a special tablecloth, dishes, towels, figurines, and those motion-activated musical animatronics that she was so fond of. Without her to guide him, Ethan had become unable to find the motivation to do much more than buy the most expensive pine tree he could find and encourage his daughters to decorate it however they saw fit. As he looked out at the darkened city, devoid of lights or festive displays of any kind, he wondered if they had all known, at least on a subconscious level, that this was coming. It was as if the whole world had known that Christmas this year was going to be a time of sorrow, and it had adorned itself accordingly. At home, there were gifts waiting under the tree, gifts that might never be opened. He had bought a microphone and speaker set for Hannah. She had used to sing all the time before her mother died, and Ethan was desperately hoping that this gift would revive that carefree part of her. He had also bought her a pop-up tent to replace those blanket forts that she loved to play under, but which kept falling down on her head whenever a corner came untucked. There was also a small leather purse, because she had said she wanted a proper, grown-up purse, like Mommy used to have. Ethan let out a sob and leaned back against the headrest. Would she ever get a chance to carry that grown-up purse? Would she even survive the night? If she did, what then? Would the sickness pass with the rising of the sun? Or would she scream and claw at the bathroom door for days until her fingers were reduced to bloody stumps, and she either bled out or beat herself to death in her efforts to escape? He set his jaw and closed his eyes tight, hoping the pressure would drive the image from his mind. Behind him, he heard a car door slam. When he opened his eyes, he saw somebody running past his car. Ahead of him, more and more people started pouring out of their vehicles. To his horror, Ethan realized that the flow of traffic had stopped for good. Ethan looked at the clock on his dashboard. The time read 2 minutes past 4. He had 3 miles between himself and his daughters, and the sun would set in less than 45 minutes. "I can make it," he whispered. His hand shook as he extracted the key from the ignition, and when he opened the car door, he was met with a blast of cold air that stung his throat and made his eyes water. The snow on the ground was shallow and slushy, and Ethan's black dress shoes had not been made to handle such terrain. Several times he lost his footing and almost went down, and before long the slush had soaked through his socks and sent an ache into his bones. He jogged onward as fast as he dared, his shoes sliding and his feet becoming increasingly numb. Members of the National Guard stood about in small clusters, trying to rub warmth into their limbs, waiting for the inevitable. Some of them had eyes that had gone red from crying. How many of them had children of their own, Ethan wondered. The icy wind whipped through his suit coat and made his teeth click together. But he kept running. The sky grew darker, and the glare of distant fires became more discernible. Ethan pulled out his cell phone and saw that it was 4:28. He was getting close, but he only had a quarter of an hour left. He slowed his pace long enough to select Madison's number, and then he resumed running with the phone held to his ear. After a few rings, he heard his daughter's voice.
Dad, where are you?
I had to leave the car. The sentence came out through his chattering teeth in broken fragments. I'm close. 10 or 15 minutes.
Hannah's crying. She said she didn't want to go into the bathroom before you get here. But now she won't stop crying. And she's hyperventilating. And I don't know what to do, Dad. She's starting to scare me. But she just might be upset. I don't want to put her by herself when she's like...
"Do it!" Ethan cried. He had heard stories on the news about what the infected children were capable of. Stories about bestial monstrosities that would keep coming after you, even if you broke their legs, cut off their arms, or set them on fire. He was suddenly struck by a mental picture of what it would be like to come home and find Madison dead, her entrails strewn about the apartment, with little Hannah standing and laughing over her sister's gored remains. "Put her in the bathroom. Now," Ethan ordered. "Tell her that it's going to be okay. Tell her that I love her." He could make out the sound of Madison sobbing over the howling of the chill wind. Then he heard her say,
I love you, Dad.
"I love you too, Madison." He hung up the phone and tried to push himself to run just a little bit faster. By the time Ethan had reached his apartment building, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a narrow red gash across the edge of the overcast sky. The snow slush was beginning to harden into a frozen crust, and the flakes were becoming larger and falling more slowly. Ethan climbed the steps to the 3rd floor, leaning heavily upon the railing to take the weight off his faltering legs. He staggered down the hall, inserted his key into the lock, and threw the door open. Madison was sitting in the recliner on the left side of the apartment, facing the gauntly decorated Christmas tree. Her arms were hanging listlessly beside her, Her head was bowed, and strands of disheveled hair were hanging across her tear-streaked face. On the right side of the room, strings of Christmas lights ran tautly from out of the coat closet to the doorknob of the bathroom door, keeping it pulled shut.
She's been quiet,
Madison said. Her eyes seemed to have become focused on some distant point below the floor, and her voice sounded very tired.
I can't tell if she's changed yet.
She uttered the word changed in a detached and casual manner, as if she had forgotten what it meant. Then a sudden look of horror crossed her face, as if the full weight of the situation had suddenly come crashing down upon her, and she let out a wail and brought a hand to her face.
It's really going to happen,
she sobbed.
We're about to lose Hannah.
Ethan staggered forward, his arms reaching out toward Madison. She rose from the chair and moved toward him unsteadily, wiping at her eyes with one hand. Ethan had almost reached her when Madison's other arm came up. There was a glint of steel on the edge of his peripheral vision, and Ethan felt a stab of pain just over his belt. Ethan glanced downward and stared at the carving fork his daughter had just plunged into his belly. The pain set in slowly, partially obliterated by his shock over what had just happened, even as gastric acid began to leak out of his punctured stomach and leach out into the wound. Madison smiled at him, her eyes betraying a joy that Ethan had not seen since before his wife had died, and she withdrew the fork and brought her arm upward. The prongs sunk into the flesh between Ethan's jawbone and Adam's apple. He took a frantic step backward, dislodging the weapon from his throat while fighting to keep his balance. He felt hot, salty blood welling up in his mouth and rushing down his throat, and expelled it with a single spattering cough. Blood splashed against Madison's face as she followed after him, but her smile never faltered. The blood continued to pour down Ethan's windpipe, but he had no breath left with which to eject it. He drew a sharp, gurgling breath, drawing the blood into his chest, and then erupted into a fit of coughing that quickly changed into an empty, breathless retching. Dizzy, in the throes of agony and overwhelmed by grief, Ethan's vision went dark, and his legs faltered. Madison's laughter rang in his ears as he fell, and no sooner had he hit the floor than she threw herself upon him, shrieking in ecstasy as she plunged the carving fork into his body, again and again. In due time, Madison dropped the carving fork beside Ethan's mangled body, went to the bathroom door, loosened the strings of Christmas lights, and swung the door open. Hannah came out, her eyes wide with anticipation. When she saw her dead father, she clapped her hands and squealed.
Me next.
She giggled.
I want to kill the next one. There's plenty enough for all of us.
Madison reminded her with a laugh.
Before we go out, do you want to help me with the decorations?
The two sisters had not had so much fun in many, many years. The blood that ran down from where they nailed their father's body to the wall added a much-needed splash of festive red color to the room, and the way Madison strung out his intestines across the edges of the ceiling filled Hannah with glee. The two sisters stood side by side, watching as hot orange flames burned away the foul-smelling pine tree that their father had brought into their home. Outside, red and blue lights were flashing merrily, and they could hear the sounds of people screaming mingled with the sound of intermittent gunfire. The fire was beginning to take hold on the carpet by then, spreading outward from a pile of charring boxes, the melting remains of a microphone and speaker set, and a small, shriveling leather purse. Hannah smiled contentedly and leaned her head against Madison's arm.
This really is going to be the best Christmas ever, isn't it? Yes,
Madison replied.
I believe it is.
After that, the two sisters put on their coats, boots, and warmest pairs of gloves, and went outside to play with the other children.
"Hey, honey," said Mark. "Could you switch the radio to Christmas songs?" Jennifer sighed with mock exasperation and flicked the dial. Bing Crosby's unmistakable croon poured from the speakers like fresh maple syrup. "Perfect," said Mark. Jennifer drove her Explorer along the narrow twists of rural roads with names like Southwoods and Mount Misery toward her cousin's cabin. This holiday excursion to the New Jersey Pine Barrens was a last-minute plan suggested by her cousin, Nick. He'd stopped by their house last weekend for an early Christmas visit. Nick was traveling to Tahiti for his Christmas vacation and visiting his Philadelphia family members before he left. Jennifer felt that Nick and the other relatives on the Decatur side of the family tree put on airs. They were rich from wealth passed down from a series of naval commodores who served in both the American Revolution and the War of 1812. The Decaturs always found a way to force these and other flattering historical family facts into conversation. During a one-sided discussion from Nick about how unspoiled Tahiti is, Jennifer mumbled about how nice it would be to go on vacation. Nick smiled and offered them a chance to stay in his winter cabin for the holidays. Mark, ever the eager puppy, jumped at the chance for a romantic getaway. She was conflicted by this prospect because, although the Decaturs always boasted about this cabin and she'd never seen it, she had an important project for work that she absolutely needed to finish by the end of the year. When she saw Mark's pleading eyes, she considered how things between them had been strained. Work at her branding agency job had taken up her time. Jennifer agreed on the condition that she could work on the project during their stay. Nick handed over his key to the cabin. He told them he kept it fully stocked with food and other amenities, but that they needed to arrive there by the 20th, since dangerous drivers heading to their own cabins for the holidays overran the roads then. As Jennifer drove along the back roads, a silver BMW zipped by around a sharp curve, and she thought to herself how glad she was they were arriving on the 19th. "I'm pretty sure this is the turn," said Mark. The white SUV slowed as they approached a barely visible offshoot from the main road. The new route was more of a path than a road, snow-covered and encroached upon by icicle-covered pine branches. Jennifer turned on the vehicle's four-wheel drive and attempted to navigate the terrain without sliding or knocking icicles onto the Explorer. Said Jennifer. "You're doing a great job," said Mark. It was about a half-mile to the cabin, and it remained snowy and hedged in by pines for the rest of the drive. When they finally saw the cabin, Mark exclaimed in wonder. "Wow, it's gorgeous," said Jennifer. Jennifer had to admit that the cabin was stunning. It looked like a child's vision of a fairy tale cabin built from Lincoln logs and gingerbread cookies. But rather than children's fancies, someone had made it with actual pine wood lumber, shellac, and paint. The wood was freshly varnished, and elaborate carved ornamental designs adorned the cabin's frontispiece. It looked prepared for Christmas, with the bells, garlands, wreaths, and ribbons strung upon its overhang and window frames. They parked in front of the cabin and hauled their luggage to the porch. It was surprisingly dingy, considering the state of the cabin. The brass was burnished and had traces of verdigris in its crooks. Jennifer reached into her pocket and pulled out the key that Nick had given her the previous week. She unlocked the door and Mark walked in, leaving the luggage he'd set down on the porch behind. "Oh my gosh," he exclaimed. "This place is freaking amazing." Hauling in her luggage, Jennifer followed Mark inside. The interior was extravagantly furnished. Atop a massive Persian rug rested a polished oak table surrounded by brushed leather furniture. To her left was a modernly furnished and immaculate kitchen, To her right was a stairwell that led up to an open loft bedroom with an enormous bed, its towering frame and columnar posts made of black walnut. Below the bedroom, Jennifer could make out a porcelain clawfoot tub in a partitioned bathroom. Opposite the entrance was a huge marble fireplace, and in the far corner of the room rose a fir tree that brushed the rafters. It was at least 18 feet tall and decked out in the same trimmings as the cabin's exterior. Atop the tree rested a polished silver star. Its appearance was unique, with letter-like filigree twisting around its 5 points. "Isn't this place great?" asked Mark. Said Jennifer. Jennifer pointed to the head of a ram or goat mounted above the fireplace's mantel. She then pointed to a chandelier hanging above them. At first glance, when she had entered the cabin, she thought it was made of antlers, like some chandeliers in log cabins. This one, however, was made of the same twisted horns of the creature that rested above the fireplace. "Yeah, those are kinda creepy." "Okay, but you've always told me how eccentric your cousin's side of the family is, and how much they like to show off their prowess." "That's not true. People hunt for bighorn sheep. At least, they used to. Maybe a Decatur shot the stuffed guy over the fireplace in the 1800s, and the chandelier was an attempt to match the style." No argument there. Now, come on. Horns notwithstanding, this place is awesome, right? She sighed and smiled. "I'll take it. Now, let's unpack and enjoy ourselves." By the time they'd settled in, it was dark. Mark offered to look around the cabin to see if there was firewood, since the log rack next to the grandiose hearth was empty. The cabin was already heated, but he thought a roaring fire would be romantic. Jennifer wanted a snack, so she grabbed some fancy cheeses and crackers stocked inside the kitchen. She set out a plate on the oak table and grabbed her laptop so she could start on her project. After playing around with a few images in her graphic design software, she put her head into her hands. "Couldn't find any logs," said Mark as he re-entered the cabin. "Oh well. Hey, are you already working? Wasn't this trip supposed to be a chance for us to spend more time together?" Mark's jaw dropped. "Wow. I didn't know that's how you felt about just a scone's throw away. I guess being a baker isn't a real job." "It's fine. You've got important work to do. I'm gonna go upstairs and read." He grabbed a novel from his suitcase and climbed the staircase to the bedroom. Jennifer shook her head and returned to her logo. After hours of assiduous work, she heard a noise coming from outside the cabin. It was faint, but sounded like a distant flag flapping in a gale. She walked to the northeastern window of the cabin, towards its origin. The light from inside only penetrated the night a short distance, but it was enough for her to see the stillness of the snow and pine branches. Thwap, thop, thwap, thwap, thop, thwap, thop, thwap. The flapping was clearer and more audible by the window, but she couldn't make out what was responsible for it. After peering through the window for a minute, the sound stopped. Jennifer waited and listened for it to pick up again, but the night remained quiet. Mumbled Jennifer. Once she had cleared up her new workspace, she performed her pre-sleep routine, went upstairs, and slid into bed next to a dozing Mark. The next morning, Jennifer woke to an empty bed. She didn't see him after dressing and checking downstairs. She heard a loud crack from outside and ran to investigate. Mark stood over a pine stump and a split log, holding a large axe. "Hey, sweetie," he called. "I found this axe around back. I figured since there wasn't any wood, I could chop some while you do your work." Jennifer exhaled and relaxed. After some coffee and toast, she returned to work. Frustration crept in, since none of the designs looked right. Either the font needed to be clearer, the symmetry was wrong, or it just didn't pop. She decided to take a break and bring Mark some hot cocoa. He was still plodding away, even though he'd already amassed a sizable stack of wood. As Jennifer trudged toward him, careful not to spill the cocoa, she noticed how his arms swelled inside his plaid wool coat on each downswing. The cold had blushed his dimples, their pink hue complementing his tidy chestnut beard. "Oh, hi, honey," he said as she approached. "Aw, that's so sweet. Chopping all this wood is keeping me warm, but I'll never turn down a mug of hot chocolate. Thanks, babe," she said, then pecked him on the cheek. Back inside, she scoured the cabin. In a closet next to the bathroom, she found a large, worn quilt that she dragged into the kitchen. She gathered more cheese and crackers and grabbed a winter salami, knife, and ales from the refrigerator. "What you doing, babe?" asked Mark as he hauled in an armful of firewood. "Outside? A picnic?" He placed his stack in the rack next to the hearth. "Didn't you just ask me to come in from the cold?" She kissed him, and after filling a thermos with hot chocolate, she bundled the meal into the quilt and they made their way. They hiked about 100 yards until they found a lovely snow-covered glade hidden in the pines. The sun glistened off the icicles as they set up their picnic. While Jennifer and Mark enjoyed the refreshments, they reminisced and laughed about silly and joyous moments from their past. After their meal, they cuddled on the quilt and stared at the sunlight refracted through ice on the pines. The cold eventually upset their comfortable repose, so they walked hand in hand back to the cabin. When they had returned, Mark started a fire. Jennifer got back to work while he returned to his book, this time without the shared acerbity. Once again, she found herself blocked and uninspired. Her mind wandered, and her eyes unconsciously darted around the cabin until they fixated upon the star atop the Christmas tree. Its patterns and flourishes were beautiful and striking. She cried out. "What?" asked Mark. "What about it?" "Oh, wow! That's great, babe!" "That's wonderful, sweetie." "Great!" "Oh!" Mark scurried upstairs and returned holding a Tupperware container. "I baked sweets for us." He opened the lid to reveal a cornucopia of cookies, tarts, candies, macaroons, pastries, and brownies. "Not at all. We're on vacation." The couple gorged themselves. Once they had their fill, Mark rubbed his abdomen. "I think I could burst," he groaned. "I am definitely full. I think I'm going to go to bed and let these sugars and carbs digest." Jennifer luxuriated in the hot, steamy water spraying from the polished brass shower head. Sated by her dessert dinner and relaxed from the water stream, her mind arranged and positioned the letters of her company's name in ways that mirrored the Christmas star. She was happy she had time to finish the logo in her leisure time and spend her free time with Mark. A smile crept onto her face as she remembered her day with him. After drying off, she put on her nightgown and brushed her teeth. She was about to climb the stairway when she heard the noise from the previous night. It sounded louder and closer than before. Jennifer flitted toward the window and peered into the darkness. Thwap, thop, thwap, 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 thop, thwap, thop, thwap. Again, there was nothing to see. Only still snow and pines. "Yeah?" he called down from the bedroom. "What?" She looked back outside and thought she could make out the shadowy silhouette of a person at the edge of the light's reach. It looked like it was shaking or convulsing. As the flapping sound continued, she heard a cackle in the further distance. Jennifer ran toward the stairs as he trotted down. "What's going on?" The cabin was silent again. No flapping and no cackle, just her rapid breathing. "Cackle? I heard a kind of rustle outside." Mark walked to the window and peered into the distance. Jennifer crept behind him and peeked over his shoulder. The silhouette was gone. "Okay, babe, I'll check outside." Mark grabbed a poker resting by the fireplace. "I'm sure it'll be fine, and I can take care of myself." He slipped on his coat and boots and grabbed his cell phone, turning on its flashlight feature. After opening the front door, he stepped into the brisk air and closed the door behind him. Jennifer ran to the other side of the cabin to look out the window, awaiting Mark's approach. After a few seconds, she heard the crunch of his boots and saw him walk across the virgin snow. He reached the shadows and held his phone and the poker in one hand. The phone's light darted around the snow and pines as Mark traipsed further into the dark. Jennifer rasped under her breath. She watched the light shine and dim through the trees as Mark continued along the perimeter of the cabin light's expanse. It went like this for about a minute, and then she saw him returning. She sighed and waited by the door. It opened, and Mark kicked the snow on his boots against the door jamb, then closed and locked it. "Nope. Scoured the area for footprints and didn't see a thing. The snow was as smooth as silk, but only half as lovely as the silk of that nightgown on you. I bet it was animals. A coyote probably made the cackle you heard, and the flapping was an owl, or maybe even a crane. The woods aren't like Philly. There are all sorts of creatures that make weird sounds at night. Tell you what, why don't you go to bed and I'll read down by the window for an hour and listen for other weird noises." She kissed him and then retired to the bedroom. Her nerves were too frazzled to sleep, but she rested and waited for Mark's return. There were no more noises until she heard the sound of Mark's footsteps, and she embraced him as he slid into bed. Jennifer's spirits thoroughly improved the next day. She was excited about her work progress and concluded that animals were certainly responsible for the sounds in the night. After Mark cooked a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and toast, she suggested they build a snowman. They used some spent coals and a carrot they found in the pantry. "He looks great! What should we call him?" said Mark. "Oh, yeah?" Mark grabbed a handful of snow, patted it into a ball, and threw it at Jennifer. "Now who's goofy looking?" They ran around the cabin and ducked behind trees, lobbing snowballs and giggling until the cold numbed their extremities. "Call it a draw?" asked Mark. "Okay, you are indeed a mighty snow warrior. Let's go inside. I want to get started on dinner." "I wanted to surprise you with a romantic dinner. I looked through the kitchen supplies and found the makings of something special." "What am I, a barbarian?" They returned to the cabin and cleared off the snow they'd accumulated before entering. Once inside, Mark removed his coat and boots and then walked into the kitchen. "How about I make more cocoa to warm us, and then you head upstairs to work on your project?" No. I want dinner to be a surprise. Trust me, it's much more romantic this way." Jennifer rolled her eyes and sighed melodramatically. Mark made their cocoa. Jennifer grabbed one of the novels she'd brought and went to the bedroom. She didn't feel like working and was confident in completing the project in the coming days. The book was so engrossing that when Mark called for her to come down, she hadn't realized that hours had passed. The cabin smelled wonderful, Rich, savory aromas filled the air, and Jennifer wondered what Mark had made. "Ta-da!" declared Mark. He spread his arms before the table, which he decorated with a linen tablecloth and lit candles. In addition to the decorations was a glazed ham, fire-roasted chestnuts, and a baked vegetable medley made with potatoes, yams, onions, rosemary, and butter. There was also a bottle of red wine and 2 filled glasses next to their plates. "Thank you, thank you." Jennifer kissed Mark and sat at the table. She raised her glass in a toast. "To my lovely wife and a wonderful holiday." The dinner was delicious, since Mark wasn't just an amazing baker, but also a great cook. Conversation flowed as easily as the wine, and they soon found themselves blushed and tipsy. Jennifer was about to finish her last bite of vegetables when she heard the flapping. "Yeah, I definitely hear that." The noise blared through the cabin, moving from the north to the east to the south, then right above them. Flap, thop, flap, 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 thop, flap, thop, flap. Before he could respond, the clatter stopped. They stood, holding their breaths in silence. The northeastern window shattered into the cabin, showering glass shards like jagged blades of ice. Jennifer screamed and cowered as Mark ducked. Their hearts pounding, they arose to see the disarray and broken window leading into freezing night air. She whimpered. Mark walked to the fireplace and grabbed the poker from the rack. He advanced to the window with ginger steps, ferociously gripping the makeshift weapon. He stared into the black. "I don't see anything." "No, I don't see any people or animals. I don't see any tracks in the snow. I don't see what could have broken the window. Nothing." He continued staring into the distance. "Yeah." He shook his head and returned to Jennifer. "Let's pack up, then drive home." "Okay." They grabbed their keys and phones and started putting on their boots and coats. A cackle like the night before rang through the blistering cold. It sounded like whatever made it was right outside the door. Cried Jennifer. "Stay here. I'm gonna check and make sure it's safe." "It's gonna be all right. We're gonna get out of here, I promise." Mark held the poker in his right hand and slowly opened the front door with his left. It was clear that no one was outside. The path between the cabin and the SUV was unobstructed. "Stay inside the cabin for a second while I make sure everything's clear." He continued past the porch and into the snow. It crunched beneath him as he tramped toward the Explorer, continually looking around for any danger. Halfway between the vehicle and the cabin, Mark turned toward Jennifer and gestured to her with his open hand. A mass of twitching shadows lifted Mark into the air, that appalling flapping drowning out his screams. Shrieked Jennifer. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a butcher knife, and then returned to the door jamb. The scene was again quiet and empty. Looking in all directions, including the sky, she inched her way to where Mark had been carried off. A small pool of blood remained with the dropped poker. In the distance toward the woods, still just within reach of the cabin's light, she saw a small spot in the snow. She crept toward it, still holding the knife in her steel grip and looking at all angles around her. The spot was blood, and she thought she saw another out further toward the pines. Jennifer grabbed her cell phone from her pocket and turned on the flashlight feature. Her breath formed small clouds of vapor as she panted and wept. Walking through the woods, she followed the droplets with the light of her phone. She remained vigilant and kept a tight hold of the knife in her other hand as she tracked her missing husband. A voice deep inside her, maybe her instinct or just her fear, kept telling her to leave him behind and drive the Explorer back to Philly. But she loved Mark more than anything and knew there was a chance that he was still alive and that she could save him. As she continued along the bloody trail, her phone caught the outline of a person in the distance. They were too far away to make out their form clearly. She froze on the spot. She mewled. They remained still and silent. Jennifer wept and called out. The figure spasmed in a phalanx of beating wings. Jennifer screamed, and a hard object struck her temple, knocking her to the ground. Lights flashed in her peripheral vision, then darkness poured over her as she fell into oblivion. Consciousness returned slowly. Jennifer first noticed how hot her front was and how cold her back was. A painfully bright light overwhelmed her until her vision gradually adjusted. A massive bonfire burned about 20 feet in front of her. Her head rang with a deafening wail. The sound began to localize itself to her left. She tried to move in that direction, but felt her arms tied behind her to a large object. Her legs were also bound. Turning her head to the left, she saw Mark screaming and tied to a pine tree. He was covered in bloody scratches, but otherwise unharmed. "Oh God! Jennifer! It's gonna come back! I know it's coming!" "Silence, whelps!" yelled a raspy voice. Jennifer tried to call out, but only steam poured from her lips. Tears ran down Mark's face as he struggled and continued to open his mouth, but no sound came from him either. A man stepped forward into their vision and stood between them and the fire. His gaunt visage was skeletal and sickly. Clumps of hair clung to his otherwise bald and scab-ridden head. He wore tattered and ancient clothing. It looked like the garb Jennifer saw people wearing in American history books, but threadbare and moldy. "The time! It hath come!" he said, and raised his hands. She realized that not all of his clothing looked shabby. On his right hand glinted a silver ring, and he wore a pendant with an engraving she couldn't make out on his backlit form. He began croaking a litany of unfamiliar words. She thought she recognized one or two words of Latin, but couldn't understand anything he said. A chill shot up her spine as she heard the flapping approaching from behind. Try as she might to scream, nothing came. A shadow crept forward and settled on the grisly man's right side. It seized in a frenzy of rapid wing beats, each thunderous pulse contracting Jennifer's stomach in repulsed horror. The creature transfixed her. From most angles, it appeared as the shadowy form of a man, or at least something man-shaped. However, she caught the occasional glimpse of something altogether more terrifying. 6 leathery wings rose from its back and furiously flapped at random intervals. Its face looked almost human, but stretched out, giving it an ovine quality. Atop its head twisted a crown-like tangle of horns, the same horns as those inside the cabin. Its lower half was an enormous serpent whose slithering propelled it forward. It was an abomination, a walking nightmare. "Ye should boweth your heads, be ye now in the presence of royalty. Duke Astaroth is mighty indeed, and has cometh for what is rightly his." The man raised his hand in front of his face and gestured toward Mark. The thing opened its mouth to reveal thousands of needle-like teeth. When it spoke, its voice sounded with the roar of 1,000 night beasts before rending the flesh of their prey.
Ever so kind, Titanleads.
Unlike anything experienced by Jennifer before, a stench emanated from its mouth and assailed her, almost rendering her unconscious. It smelled of death, bile, excrement, sulfur, and other things no earthly nostril was meant to smell. The thing slithered toward Mark, and the man followed behind. Mark still screamed in silence as it looked him up and down. With a claw-fingered hand, it swiped across his midsection, spilling his intestines onto the snow. Jennifer again tried, unsuccessfully, to scream. The man faced her.
Flesh, it is weak, but the viscera, it is powerful. Mighty powerful for those proper skilled to useth it.
He reached into the wound and pulled out more of Mark's intestines. Blood, chyme, and undigested chestnut chunks spattered onto the snow as he gazed intently at Mark's dribbling entrails. Mark was still alive. He thrashed his head, mouth agape as the ghoulish fiend poured over his insides. After minutes of investigation, the man dropped what he held to the ground and nodded his head. The creature slid toward Mark and again opened its mouth, spreading its stench over the area. The inside of its mouth protruded from its face to reveal what looked like a horse's skull, full of porcelain needles. It struck like a viper and tore through Mark's chest, leaving a gaping hole where his heart used to be. Mark's head dropped forward as blood and pieces of lung and ribcage fell onto the pile of his outside innards. Astaroth chewed and tore him apart, as blood dribbled down the bony extrusion one could only approximately call its chin. Both the old man and the monster stepped toward Jennifer. She prayed for a miracle, to somehow break free and run back to the explorer, for an angel to come down and smite these things to hell. She prayed, but she knew there was no hope. The man smiled as she thought this, as though he knew exactly what she thought. The demon slithered right up to Jennifer. She stared into its infernal eyes and knew there was no hope. It stared back and smiled.
So, I had just about finished the genitals on the gingerbread man when my husband's voice boomed through the kitchen, making me slip and leaving one particular cookie way more in doubt than he had any right to be. What? Y'all don't make yours anatomical? Well, it's a naughty little Christmas tradition we started since we have no kids. Oh, don't act like you don't do it, or know someone who has. Anyway, Mike was beyond mad at whatever the hell he was going on about in the other room. I stifled a sigh and gave myself permission for a quick eye roll before entering the living room.
The fucking Browns! Do you see this, Helen?
He asked, frantically gesturing to our front window. No response entered my mind or left my lips, as I knew I wouldn't need one.
This is a tiny boxed-in cul-de-sac. There isn't room for half of the holiday shit he puts up. And this new one...
He pauses to let out a scoff.
Ha! This takes the cake!
Across the street sat Mary and George Brown. They were the sweetest older couple, never hurt or bothered anybody, but for some reason, they represented every insecurity my husband had about himself. He was never too rude or hateful to their face, but only because I bore the brunt of his verbal diarrhea behind their backs. An inflatable Santa Claus consumed most of the entrance to their front yard, like 10 pounds of leaves crammed into an 8-pound trash bag. At first, I thought Mike was just being an asshole, but the thing really is grotesquely huge. The garishly green sack of toys attached to his midsection was at least half as tall as I was. It had large, almost anime-like blue eyes, accompanied by an impish, round face. It looked ashamed, but pleased, like someone just caught its hand in the cookie jar.
They even parked their car on the street just to make room for it.
Mike prattled on.
You can probably see the fucking thing from space, Helen. From space!
The tinny chime of our doorbell interrupted his tirade. My gratitude for a temporary escape sped my steps to the door. Mrs. Brown's rosy face greeted me from our front porch. Hello, Mrs. Brown. Would you like a cookie? I have some freshly made in the kitchen. My manners completely made me forget the fact that they were naughty gingerbread cookies, tits and all. I mean, how the hell was I going to give this woman a well-hung cookie? Oh, no, thank you, dear. George is diabetic, so I try to avoid sugars myself if I can. Solidarity and whatnot. I was all too relieved to hear her decline. She had a husband. I mean, it's not like she hadn't seen a penis in her day, but on a cookie and at Christmas, the Lord's holiday. Proverbial sparkles danced in the corners of her eyes as she smiled up at me. George and I are going out of town to see our boys for the Christmas holiday, back home to West Virginia, where we're from. We leave tomorrow morning, and we'll be back by Sunday evening if the weather permits. Do you have any plans, dear? She asked. I could tell she was hopeful for a certain answer, but which one I wasn't sure yet. Nope, not really. We're just gonna buy a pre-made turkey meal from the market and open gifts before bed on Christmas Eve. My family came down sick this holiday, so we're going to reconvene in January when everyone's feeling better. An audible sigh of relief escaped her thin lips, quickly concealed by a look of concern. Oh, that's too bad about your folks, honey. But would it be any trouble for one of you to collect the mail and maybe shovel the walk the day before we're due back? I'll be happy to pay you for your troubles, Mary explained. Mike wasn't going to be happy, but when an adorable little lady asks you to help her, what kind of person would I be to say no? We had to shovel ours anyway, and, well, theirs was just across the way. Hell, I'll do it myself if he doesn't want to. Of course, Mrs. Brown, we'd be happy to. No payment necessary. You guys just have fun on your trip, okay? If you really want to pay me, bring me back some pepperoni rolls, yeah? I winked. She chuckled, agreed, and told us to have a Merry Christmas as she left the front porch. I watched as her aging frame shuffled across our yard and into hers, stopping to brush some loose snow off the Santa Claus before going inside. My husband had overheard the entire exchange and is now eyeing me furiously.
Aren't there enough things you ask me to do here? At home?
I cut him off at the pass. Yeah, look, I know. It's really no big deal, okay? I'll do it myself if you insist on being an asshole. You know, I remember when we bought our first home together, you couldn't wait to show our family off to the neighbors. The way you act now, you'd think we were the older couple.
How long are they gonna be gone?
He interrupted. Only 5 days. She's gonna bring back West Virginia pepperoni rolls. Huh? It's gonna be fine. Mike's eyes took on a glint of mischief as he inhaled to speak.
So, do you think they'll deflate Santa before they go?
What the fuck?
If they don't, can I do it?
He interrupted. At this point, I just wanted it all to be over with. The last thing I wanted to incur was another one of his rants. The negativity takes layers off of one's life. I just know it does. So, I agreed. All right, if they don't deflate it, you can let the air out of the damn thing. As long as you don't damage it, I don't care. But you're shoveling that walk. The next morning came and went. We waved the Browns off as they drove away. The Santa Claus loomed in their wake, swaying tauntingly at my husband. It was almost funny, really. I can remember giggling despite the anger I felt boiling in his chest.
It haunts me, Helen.
He grumbled.
Look at it over there mocking me. You know, I swear it turns more towards our house every day, the tiniest bit.
Don't be upset. You get to deflate it, remember? Give it 1 hour and... Mike was already across the lawn heading into their yard to inspect his inflatable nemesis. I watched him struggle with the mechanics of the pump in order to turn it off. It really was amazing how long those things take to fully deflate. We watched it from our front window. It was sad, like watching the wicked warlock of the North Pole shrink and warp to its defeat. It just melted into itself until it was nothing but a nylon puddle in their front yard. I spent the rest of the day researching the internet. That's what it's there for, right? Seriously though, I had no idea how to reinflate that thing by the time they got home. I wasn't sure if I needed a pump or if there was a button you pushed. Mike was completely unsympathetic to my concern, so it's not like he was going to explain it to me.
We'll just tell him it was really windy here one day, so I deflated it to prevent it from being damaged. Problem solved. It's better than my initial plan of stabbing a hole in it with a shovel and saying it was an accident,
he said nonchalantly. I shook my head disgustedly. Unbelievable.
What, Helen? You want to tell her that the neighborhood kids had their way with it and have her call the cops to file a report?
I shook my head, resigning myself to end the argument then and there, if only for the moment. I love my husband, but if you can't tell, he can be a real pain in the ass, and it's only gotten worse since he's been laid off. He literally does nothing but fixate, mope, and complain all day. I slept with my back to him that night, as I had many nights before. My heart was torn between loving my husband despite his moods, or loving myself enough to let him go. When you get married, they say it's for better or worse, but how bad does it have to be? I mean, how much worse can things get sometimes? The welcoming smell of coffee didn't wake me the next day, nor the morning sun shining through the windows. It was the sound of my husband yelling in the kitchen.
What the hell is this?
He was gesturing frantically once again toward our front window.
I can't fucking believe this.
The Santa Claus stood proud and victorious on their front lawn as if nothing ever changed. I couldn't believe my eyes. Maybe it's on a timer, I muttered uselessly. Mike burst through the kitchen. My shoulder knocked back against the wall as I backed out of his way. His eyes were menacingly wide, and his features were set hard. It looked like they had never seen a day of joy. A clatter filled the room as he rummaged through the dishwasher. Mike? Hey, what are you doing? My voice came out high-pitched but even-toned. Getting angry hadn't ever done me any good when he got like that. He emerged with a kitchen knife, one of the sharpest that we've had.
That windstorm.
He breathed through huffs.
Maybe it blew a tree branch into their Santa, and I didn't notice it until I was shoveling their walk.
Those poor people. I really shouldn't joke about such things, but maybe I should increase my knowledge of divorce law for my New Year's resolution. I didn't even bother to watch him this time. If he wanted to assassinate that poor lawn ornament in front of the other neighbors, who the hell was I to stand in his way? Maybe he'd at least shut the hell up about it after he's done. A peaceful Christmas seemed impossible while he was in one of his dark, obsessional moods. Right then, a scream cut through the cold air, lingering to muffle through the window panes before reaching my ears. I began to run to the front door as fast as my feet would take me. On my way out, I glanced at the window, coming to a screeching halt at the sight before me. Mr. and Mrs. Brown's front yard was a smattering of crimson against the white of freshly fallen snow. The Santa Claus figure's beard was peppered with dots of blood, making an almost candy cane pattern as they dripped down onto its chest. My husband lay gurgling in the street by their mailbox. His eyes were wide open, unmoving, as he struggled and failed to breathe. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I looked up from the screen, Santa was moving. A figure dressed in black erupted from the middle of the Santa suit, bleeding profusely from the left arm. He left trails of blood throughout the snow as he ran off through their backyard. Police came in no time at all, apprehending and calling an ambulance for the man that had now killed my husband. It turned out he had been casing their house for a couple of weeks. He knew they'd be going on vacation and depended on the cover of the inflatable to hide himself until nightfall. The robber survived his injuries and fully served out a 5-year sentence in a prison the next county over. 5 years. That's all he got for ruining my life. Christmas will never be the same to me. I sold that house and moved halfway across the United States in order to start anew. I've since remarried during that time, and we now have a 3-year-old daughter. I'm a lot happier now, but still scarred. A chill goes up my spine every time we see an inflatable Christmas decoration. And what's worse? Our neighbor just put up the largest inflatable snowman I've ever seen across the street.
I wasn't an idiot. I knew what was going on. Sure, my parents called it a vacation, but that wasn't it at all. I knew things were going to change after my dad was injured and couldn't work anymore, and when my mom's hours got cut at the office, it was just coming. I didn't expect us to move whatever we could into the van and hit the road, though. We were homeless. Mom called it a vacation. She kept telling us we were just on vacation while we tried to find a new house to buy since we were also going to move. In the meantime, we'd sleep out of our van. It was a lot of fun. I probably would have asked them to stop lying if it was just me. We were sleeping in our van because we had nowhere else to go. It wasn't fun. But I had my little brother Dylan to think about. Dylan thought this was a lot of fun. Dad managed to find his old portable DVD player so we'd stay up late watching movies. We'd go to the library during the day to read or borrow movies, and whenever I was feeling antsy, I'd go find bottles to recycle. I'd tell Dylan we were on a treasure hunt, and he was surprisingly good at finding cans that I'd overlook. Once we got enough, we'd recycle them and get a few snacks. It could have been worse. We could have not had the van, after all. Or we could have been taken from our parents and put into foster care. Oddly, we wouldn't have been put in the same home, and I never would have ever seen Dylan or my parents again. But being homeless in the winter months made things a lot worse. It got cold. Real cold. I woke up with my teeth chattering at night because we couldn't keep the van idling all night. Wasted gas and would attract unwanted attention. I'd usually end up cuddling up to Dylan to at least keep some warmth. In the mornings, our windows would be covered in a layer of frost that would get thicker every week. I hate the cold now. I've never liked it, but what happened on December 23rd cemented my hatred of it forever. Dad was out trying to get a job. Mom was in the van with us playing Go Fish. We were parked not far from the playground, and Dylan was trying to convince me that going down the iced-over slide would be fun and not a great way to freeze your butt off. There was a knock at the window, and Mom nearly jumped out of her skin before realizing the old man was a friend.
Mr. Cooper!
She grinned ear to ear before she pulled open the door.
Come on in. Get out of the cold for a bit.
Mr. Cooper was another homeless person in the area. He wasn't lucky enough to have a car to sleep out of, but he was a cheery old soul with red cheeks and a bright white beard. Obviously, given the time of year, Dylan took one look at him and assumed he was Santa. Mr. Cooper never did anything to dissuade that. Mr. Cooper hopped into the car and blew on his hands.
Thank you. It's getting real chilly out there. How's the 3U this morning?
He asked. Could be worse, I piped up, eyeing the bulges under Mr. Cooper's jacket. He noticed my curious eyes and chuckled.
Well, it's a few more days before the big event, but...
He unzipped his ratty red coat and out came a few boxes.
Wait till Christmas to open these, but I hope you like them.
They didn't even have proper tags. Our names were written on them with pen, but that didn't matter. They were presents for Christmas. Dylan and I cheered and piled the boxes in between the front seats. I wanted to open them up now, but since I doubted Mom or Dad had anything left for presents, I forced myself to sit on my hands. My mom's eyes were wet with unshed tears, but she was smiling.
You're too good to us, Mr. Cooper. Thank you,
she said, knowing better than to say no to a gift. She tried once when Mr. Cooper brought Dylan and me the pack of cards we were playing with now. Mr. Cooper had kept insisting, and when she didn't budge, he just happened to leave it here. and when Mom tried to give them back, he just pretended she was trying to give him a gift and used every excuse he made back at her. I nearly cried laughing. Mr. Cooper smiled at my mom.
Well, you're a neighbor and a friend. How could I not get your wonderful boys something for Christmas?
He tousled Dylan's hair and then mine despite my protests.
How's your husband? Leg doing any better?
While Mr. Cooper and my mom idly chat, I turn on the old battery-powered radio that was one of our other entertainment sources as of late. Christmas music made the van we were living out of a little homier. I settled on the classic Christmas music channel, for Mom of course. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer trailed off and led into another Christmas classic. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Jack Frost nipping at your nose. The mention of Jack Frost was like a gunshot in Mr. Cooper's ears. Judging by his reaction, he visibly flinched before glancing around.
Change the station, would you, son? Don't really like this song anymore,
he said. I did what he asked, but my mom looked concerned. Mr. Cooper stared out the window and shivered.
Jack Frost doesn't nip your nose out here. Tends to bite the whole thing clean off.
Dylan's eyes popped wide open. For some reason, already had a taste for scary things. I don't know where he got it. Not from me or my parents, that was for sure. Really? He asked excitedly.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Cooper pretended to snip off his nose with his fingers.
Clean off. Nothing but a black hole in your face.
Gross! Dylan said that with the biggest grin on his face. My mom cleared her throat.
We can change the station,
she said in hopes of changing the conversation as well. Mr. Cooper, though, seemed to be stuck on that topic. He stared intensely outside like he could see the ice crystals forming in the air.
You boys, be careful now. Jack Frost isn't so kind to those outside in this place. Get back to your van before it gets dark. I don't want to see you get hurt.
I don't know why I replied at the time, but I reassured Mr. Cooper, don't worry, Jack Frost won't get us. It's freaky after dark out here anyway, I said. Dylan nodded. We like watching movies when it's dark, he piped up. Mr. Cooper chuckled and ruffled Dylan's hair.
That is a wonderful thing to do when it's dark. It makes it like a movie theater.
He coughed a few times before he opened up the van door.
Gotta get back to it. You boys have a good day now.
I watched him vanish around the corner before I returned to the card game. In no time, his warnings about Jack Frost had all but faded into my subconscious. The next day was Christmas Eve. I was up at the crack of dawn. A few snowflakes were dancing in the air, so I made sure to bundle up really well. I was on a mission that day. I was going to gather enough cans to recycle to afford something special for Christmas Day. Some snacks, maybe a small toy, maybe even a Happy Meal for Dylan. Something to make tomorrow just a little more special. I only got a block away before I heard Dylan yelling, "Wait for me!" I turned to see him with his coat half-zipped, missing a mitten and grinning ear to ear. "Didn't Mr. Cooper's talk about Jack Frost teach you nothing?" I tutted my tongue, but I waited for him to catch up. I got his coat zipped up the rest of the way. "Where's your other mitten?" Dylan shrugged. "I don't know." "Well, there's nothing to do about that. Just keep your hand in your pocket," I said. Thankfully, as the sun rose in the sky, it got pretty nice outside. I even ended up unzipping my coat because of how warm it was outside. I didn't tell Dylan we were gathering bottles for Christmas tomorrow, wanting to keep the surprise. But he was still chattering about getting Mom a diamond ring because we'll make so much money off all these bottles. It made me laugh, but it was cute. We barely even stopped for lunch. We walked for miles from place to place, filling bags with bottles. I was so determined I didn't even think about the time until we were recycling the latest bunch, and Dylan went, "It's dark." I dropped the last bottle I was holding and it cracked when it hit the floor. I turned around and sure enough the sun was just slipping past the horizon. The last traces of orange marked the sky, replaced by blackness. Clouds hung heavy and I saw the wind blow a piece of trash down the sidewalk. I never wanted to be out after dark, even with my parents. I would claim I wasn't scared of the dark, which was technically correct, but I was scared of what could be in the dark. People who kidnap kids, muggers, all sorts of people that were worse than any boogeyman Mr. Cooper could tell us stories about. But I had to be calm. So I just scooped up the cracked bottle and handed it to Dylan, figuring the machine wouldn't accept it. "Let's get back to the van then," I said casually as I punched the button to get the bottle ticket. I'd wanted to cash it before we left, but I wasn't going to waste time. Keep your hand in your pocket. Hold on to mine with your other. Let's hurry back. Mom and Dad will be so proud of how many bottles we gathered. I knew we made a mistake when we left the store. The wind that was soft during the day now cut through my coat like a knife. The dark made it tricky to recognize landmarks and see the street signs to know where to go back. But I couldn't let Dylan know I was freaking out. He was my little brother. I was responsible for him. So I just squeezed his hand tight and kept urging him along. I gave other people a wide berth. I'm sure some might have looked nice, but I knew better than to ask for directions or to borrow their phones. Besides, my brain was so rattled I didn't even know if I could remember my mom's phone number. The sliver of sun we had disappeared in minutes, the street lamps dimly illuminating the paths ahead of us. Dylan clung to my side, and I could feel him shivering. He'd not layered up like I had, only grabbing his winter coat. I knew we were in trouble when the street lamps suddenly flicked out. The street had been plunged into darkness. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of us before the blackness swallowed up anything or anyone before us. Every hair on my body stood right on end, and I skidded to a stop. Riley? Why are the street lights off? It's nighttime. They need to be on. Dylan's teeth were chattering so much I could barely understand him. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I couldn't be afraid. I had to be brave. Power outage, maybe, I said. We better keep moving. Riley, what's that? Before I could take a step, Dylan's grip on my hand tightened until it felt like it was going to break my bones. But I was gripping back on his just as tight. Because Jack Frost had walked out from an alley in front of us. Its head swiveled towards us, and its bleached eyes stared right at us. It wasn't a human, even if it looked like one. It was far too tall, with skin white as bone and arms so long they nearly reached his knees. It wore a white suit, but its hands and feet were bare, its fingers and toes blackened with icy nails. It then smiled, cocking its head to the side. Its mouth was filled with rows of icicles instead of teeth. It opened its mouth to speak, but before it could, Dylan pitched his fist back and reared it forward, throwing the bottle right at its head. Run, he screamed before he was the one dragging me across the street. When Jack Frost laughs, it sounds like cracking ice, and you get the same feeling in your gut as if you were standing on a frozen pond and heard that very sound. It finally geared me into moving, and we both bolted down the street, skidding on patches of ice that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and swerving down streets we'd never walked down, even in broad daylight. The bad parts of our city weren't as bad as some, but they were still bad. We turned into an alley and ran right in the middle of two guys, one handing money to another that was handing him a baggie. The dealer jumped and swore when we just about crashed into him.
Jesus fuck, where's the fire?
He said. Dylan blurted out, Jack Frost is chasing us! The buyer snickered awkwardly before that sheepish expression faded away into pure horror. I felt a wind that was more ice than air. The dealer audibly swallowed as he inched backward.
Kids, don't look back. Keep going. Do not look back,
he said. I gulped but walked after him, the dealer not taking his eyes off of what was undoubtedly behind us. The buyer was figuratively frozen in place for a moment too long before I heard something crunching and cracking.
I'm stuck. I'm stuck to the ground. What the fuck is that thing?
I almost turned, but the dealer whistled.
Nope. Keep going. It's too late for him. Now! Run!
The dealer actually picked up Dylan, and we hauled out of there while I heard the buyer scream, and scream, and scream even louder. We got a few blocks away before the dealer set Dylan back down and caught his breath.
Stupid bastard. You don't laugh about Jack Frost around here,
he grumbled. Wait, he's real? I blurted out. Dylan gave me a no-duh kind of look. Mr. Cooper said he was. Did you think he was lying? I searched for an answer, but thankfully, the dealer saved my butt by speaking up first and distracting Dylan.
Jack Frost has been here long before I've been, probably longer than Cooper.
The dealer glanced around before he ushered us along.
Jack Frost will be here after we're gone, too. It's always been here, and we all know to get where it's warm so it can't get us. Please tell me, for the love of God, that you've got somewhere warm to go.
We live in our parents' van, Dylan said. We lost our house. Will the van be okay? I stared at Dylan. I really thought he didn't know. He'd always been so bouncy and happy, but the look on his face was one of quiet resignation. The dealer chewed his bloodied bottom lip before he nodded.
Yeah, that'll have to work, especially if your parents are still in there. I'm Josh, okay? I'm friends with Mr. Cooper. Well, we tolerate each other. He doesn't care for my business. I'll get you back to your van, and hopefully Jack finds someone else to mess with tonight. Where are they parked?
I listed off the street where the car was last seen. I knew Josh was not Mr. Gold Star citizen, but our options are limited now, and he'd save Dylan. And he knew Jack Frost.
The colder you are, the stronger he gets.
He peered around corners before we went down. We'd take alleys and back ways. Josh said it wasn't the quickest way, but the way that blocked the most wind. He also talked a lot. Quietly, but he did talk.
I've been out here since I was not much bigger than this squirt right here.
He gave Dylan's shoulder a gentle shake.
Mr. Cooper taught me about Jack. I thought he was full of shit. Crap at first. I didn't really believe in anything I couldn't see back then, but then I saw Jack Frost, and I saw it kill 2 sleeping bums. Just came right up to them and froze them to the ground. I got lucky. It was satisfied after that, so it didn't come to get me too.
Dylan whimpered quietly. "The song makes him sound so nice," murmured.
Maybe there's nicer Jack Frosts out there. This one's not. It's quiet, it's quick, it's smart, and it's a pain in the dick-ass butt. Fuck! Please don't repeat any shit I say.
I couldn't help but laugh quietly. Of all the things to be freaked out about right now, I wouldn't put cuss words at the top of the list. It made Dylan smile a bit too. I almost thought we'd lost Jack until Josh peered around a corner and immediately shot back.
Shit, it's there.
I looked too, and sure enough, Jack was strutting down the street, its head turning back and forth as it searched. Josh pushed both Dylan and me behind him, his throat nervously bobbing up and down as he glanced around, no doubt for us or some other poor soul stuck out here at night.
It could pass by. If it doesn't, fucking run as fast as you can. We're almost to the van. Hopefully your parents have it on. Jack won't get close to it if it's running car.
The heat scares it? I asked quietly. Josh shrugged.
I don't know. It just doesn't like the heat.
Something occurred to him at that moment, and he reached into his pocket.
Just in case we're cornered or get split up. Here.
He handed me a lighter.
It's like spitting at a wildfire, but it's something. I got one too.
I flicked the wheel and saw the little flame flickering. Just that bit of warmth felt so good on my hands. But I didn't keep it going for long, just sticking the lighter in my pocket. "Thanks, Josh," I said. Josh smiled crookedly down at me.
Just doing what Cooper would have done for me back in the day. Shh. It's getting closer. Get against the wall and be quiet.
I gulped and followed his instructions, and so did Dylan. Josh was shaking, whether it was because he was scared too or just cold, I don't know. Seconds ticked by. Then Jack stepped into sight and I nearly wet myself. This close I could see that its face was emaciated like a withered corpse, and there was blood on its icy claws. It paused in front of the alley. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop my breathing from making so much sound. I prayed for it to leave, but on that Christmas Eve, God clearly wasn't listening because it turned and faced right into the alley.
Shit!
Josh booked it and Dylan and I were right on his heels. Jack laughed again, but that terrible crackling ice sound, and I could hear its bare feet slapping against the asphalt. Going as fast as we were, I felt my footing go, but I shoved Dylan ahead before I did. He slid across it and ended up staying on his feet, but I crashed to the ground, my face bouncing off the pavement and my nose bursting with blood that spurted down my lips and chin. I'm not surprised I missed that patch of black ice. I heard Dylan scream something behind me, but I couldn't move. I rolled and turned to see Jack standing above me. From the ground, Jack seemed even bigger than it already was. Gulping, I grabbed the lighter from my pocket and flicked it back on. Jack flinched back at the sight of the flame, its malicious smile turning into a cringe. I took that precious second of time to get up and slowly walk backward, careful not to fall again. If I fell, I knew I'd drop that lighter. If I dropped that lighter, I was dead meat. But Jack recovered after that second. He leaned down and puffed out a mouthful of breath which was laced with snowflakes. The lighter blew out. I thought I was dead. And then I heard a bellowing shout.
Jack! Get away from that boy!
Jack turned his head and I scrambled back towards Dylan, who was bawling his eyes out. It was Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper bared his yellow teeth at the horrific Jack Frost.
You want a victim? Come and get it!
He then did the stupidest thing one can do in below zero weather. Mr. Cooper ripped his coat off. Underneath he only wore a thin white t-shirt, grungy and stained with a few holes along the collar.
This enough for you, demon? Have my shoe, too!
Mr. Cooper took off one of his boots and threw it right at Jack's head. It connected, making the most comical bonk sound as it bounced off Jack's jaw. Jack Frost stumbled back and Mr. Cooper looked at me. He nodded.
Run, boys! Run, and Jack won't catch you!
I ran. I grabbed Dylan's hand, Josh grabbed the other one, and we booked it down the street, away from Mr. Cooper yelling expletives so obscene I wouldn't repeat them even if I had been paid. Started crying too when I saw the van. My mom was right outside, suiting up to obviously come looking for us.
Dylan! Riley, where in God's name? Who is...
Ma'am, with all due respect, get in the goddamn car!
Josh shouted. He again picked up Dylan and tossed my brother into the van, climbing in after him and pulling my mother and me inside. I slammed the van door behind us. The van was mercifully idling at the time, and I pressed myself against one of the heating vents as I laughed hysterically. We escaped. The warmth had never felt so good. Dylan had collapsed against the floor, wheezing as he caught his breath. Josh slid into one of the bucket seats. My dad just stared from the driver's seat. "What the hell just happened?" he said. My mom didn't even get pissed at him for swearing. Josh took a deep breath before glancing out the window. He didn't say a thing, he just pointed. Jack Frost had started down the alley we were parked down, but it stopped, and this time it visibly balked at the heat from the car. It growled before it turned right back around and stalked away. Josh cleared his throat.
Jack Frost was about to take off more than just your kids' noses,
he said. My mother crossed herself and started softly praying under her breath. Josh leaned back in the seat.
Mind if I hide out here for the night? Jack's usually gone by the time the sun rises,
he said. My dad looked him up and down before he finally shrugged. Yeah, you're staying in here, kid. Josh looked affronted by the kid comment, but he surrendered. When Dylan finally caught his breath, he sat up and leaned against the van door. His face was still red, but the cold sweat had finally started to dry and left his hair sticking in hilarious directions. Riley, where did Mr. Cooper go? I didn't want to respond to that, but I did anyway. Honestly, I don't know. That night, none of us slept. Even my parents, who only caught that glimpse of Jack Frost, couldn't sleep. I learned that Josh was only 16, so he was just a kid like me, even if that description made him scowl. Dawn just broke when we got our answer for the fate of Mr. Cooper. I heard the ambulance sirens and knew, but I had to see. So I put my coat back on and exited the van. My mom followed, and I heard her tell Dylan to stay put. She didn't even try to tell me to stay. I was already heading down the street. The body bag had already been zipped shut, but they draped his red coat over it. My mom softly sobbed as I nervously approached one of the EMTs. "What happened?" I asked, quietly. The man looked up, probably ready to tell me to shoo when he saw the look on my face.
Are you looking for someone?
He asked. "Is it Mr. Cooper?" The EMT glanced over at one of the others before he sighed and nodded.
Yeah, his ID says that. Sorry, kid. Got pretty cold out here last night, and, well, not everyone's lucky enough to have a home on Christmas.
Didn't I know it? I rested my hand on that red coat that made my brother think of Santa Claus before I turned around and walked away. I was dry-eyed all the way back to the car. Dylan looked up from the box he was opening up. "Is Mr. Cooper okay?" he asked. I swallowed, and then I lied one last time to my little brother. "He's just fine. A bit cold, but fine. Merry Christmas, Dylan."
I'm sure you have heard all the stories about the Christmas tree. It once originated back in ancient Scandinavia, when the Vikings cut down a big spruce tree every winter. This was to celebrate Yule during the winter solstice. They displayed them in their long mead halls during festivities in the winter, decorating them with long-forgotten pagan symbols in the workshop of their ancient Norse gods. It is believed that the ornaments traditionally used to decorate trees, the red and gold balls, came from Germany in the Middle Ages. They decorated their Christmas trees with apples and balls of glass at that time. This is still true, but I must tell you about what I now believe is the natural origin of this tradition. My family has lived in the northern part of Norway for generations. We have also always owned this old rustic mansion close to the border of Sweden. It's located close to some of the area's most prominent mountains, and a thick spruce forest surrounds it. The estate has been in our family for generations. There is no written record of the date it was built, but we speculate that the inner parts are at least 500 years old. Around the surrounding forest, there are various ancient decaying ruins and runestones. There is not much to say about the ruins. They are primarily old, collapsed stone buildings with no roofs. Most of them are not even standing anymore. We have invited archaeologists from the University of Oslo, and they date most of the fallen buildings to be around 1,300 to 1,000 years old. They have oddly never found any skeletons or corpses around the ruins. There are a few rock-covered graves, but they are all empty. They explain that people back then in this area used to burn their relatives and scatter their ashes. Some runestones have been found around the estate, and unfortunately, only a few of them have been properly translated. The translatable few of them mostly say mundane things like, Einar, son of Harald, raises this stone to honor his dead father, and I raise this rock in memory of my brother Leif. There are 3 large ominous stones placed in the middle of the forest that gave me a creepy feeling when I walked by the area as a child. They have never been adequately translated, since the runes etched into them are so faded that they barely make any sense reading them. Only a few sentences are even remotely readable, and what has been translated reads, Goddess Hela, Watcher of Life and Death, followed by, Breathe your life into us, All Mother. And it just ends with, Black Goat. This stone formation looks archaic, and the high treetops of this forest make sure daylight never hits the dark moss-covered rocks. The area around this place is filled with giant spruces, and the bark of these trees has an almost skin-like texture that grows unusually thick and eventually cracks. The branches look elongated and crooked. Every bend of the tree has a bone-like appearance, and the surface is strangely warm to the touch. It is warm enough to melt the snow that falls on the trees and make melted circles on the ground around them. My grandfather had been the owner of this estate and its surrounding land for as long as I could remember. We were told growing up that we always had this family tradition that is almost as old as our family. Every 30 years we celebrate Christmas together in the old house. I will never forget my first Christmas celebration there. We called it Red Yule. I was only 11 years old at the time, and my younger sister had just turned 7 2 months ago. The first bit of snow had just hit the countryside about 2 weeks before the coming winter solstice, which is on the 21st and not the 25th, by the way. My parents had spent their first week at this place. They decorated all the windows with hanging stars and the usual small connected lights that go around the outside of the house. My grandparents were still alive back then, and I remember my old grandmother in her 80s baking Christmas cookies and building gingerbread houses with my sister and me. She helped us put icing around all the corners of the gingerbread house and filled the roof with chocolates. We were so happy back then, when everyone was together. Grandpa told us stories from the Viking times about how the great thunder god got his hammer, what they thought would happen when the world eventually ends, and why the sun and moon go up and down. He also told us stories about the resilient trees that show their green liveliness in the dead of cold and ruthless winters. This was the first time that we heard about Red Yule. Grandpa told my sister and me about it one evening. Our family has always taken care of these trees, and one night, before the winter solstice, we take out 2 plants that we have grown ourselves for years, then put them by the fireplace and watch them grow big together. It would be best if you kids stayed in your rooms that night. If you hear screams, don't be alarmed. It is the Christmas spirit that comes to bless the young trees and give them a long, everlasting life together. His voice was so cracked and lifeless at the time. There was a certain fear in his voice that never left. It smelled like he was drinking a lot before that Red Yule. He didn't feel like he was completely present at times, and he had this unnerving stare into empty space, accompanied by shivering to his breath, especially when he thought that he was alone. It was the day before Red Yule, on the 20th of December. My sister and I were playing by the fireplace when Grandmother was knitting, and she looked abnormally stressed out. Usually, she was a very relaxed and loving person, but the Yule preparations were getting on her nerves. Or maybe it was the fact that my sister and I kept asking about the Christmas trees, and when we'd get to see them, and how big they were, and how many years they'd grown. Eventually, she even became spiteful towards us. I could hear her mumbling that this wasn't even her choice, and she didn't know about it at the time. She started getting angry at the most minuscule of things, like making any loud noise in her presence. And when we started laughing loudly together, she sometimes just dropped her things and walked away. The entire day passed, and we saw no traces of those trees. I asked my parents too, but they were busy preparing the Christmas food for tomorrow, and told me not to overthink it and see them in the morning. I started thinking they just got too tired to go out and chop them down, or maybe they had forgotten all about it. I was feeling a bit drained that night. Maybe I was getting bored being out in the country with nothing to do. I can vaguely remember waking up alone in the middle of the night, as I thought I heard someone scream down the stairs. I honestly might have just dreamt most of what followed that night, or made it up as I thought about it while growing up. I was too afraid that my sister would panic from the screaming, so I didn't wake her up that night. The door was on ajar, and I took the stairs down towards the living room. There was a reddish glow from the fireplace that lit up the room. There were still no trees standing there. The only eye-catching thing I could see was my grandparents. They were sitting, dressed in their morning robes, on their knees, holding hands. Was this the Christmas spirit that Grandpa had talked about? Grandpa was mumbling something in a rough tone, as if he was having an angry conversation with Grandmother. First, I thought they were making a prayer of some kind, and after a while, I was worried that Grandma hurt herself on something, because I could see blood dripping down from her hands to the floor. At this point, I felt like I must be dreaming. After a few seconds, Grandpa started screaming out of nowhere. It just sounded like complete nonsense, and every word was incomprehensible. Then he began coughing, and it sounded like he couldn't breathe. I could hear this high-pitched wheezing sound from the top of his lungs. Grandma started doing this as well soon after him, and she fell to the ground with a loud thud. Shortly after that, I could only hear guttural sounds from both of them. They were now vomiting red and black goo, and I just stood there helpless. I tried running up to them, but this freaked me out too much. I have never been this afraid in my entire life. My entire body turned ice cold, and I could do nothing but observe what played out in front of me that night. With heavy tears falling down my cheeks, I stared so hard I stopped breathing. I saw Grandpa fall to the ground, and now both of their bodies started contorting and twisting on the living room floor as they started bleeding from all their orifices. They vomited chunks of coagulated blood, and I think even parts of their insides were coughed up. My eyes were locked open, staring at what once was my grandparents' limbs bending in strange ways. I was frozen in pure horror as their bodies still kept making detestable sounds. Their voices were moaning and gurgling, and it looked like something was growing out from their abdomen. Hundreds of skinny and long reddish branches started growing out of their guts, and two thin plants started forming out of their bodies. Blood started to pulsate out as they grew with rapid speed. At this point, I think they were alive because I remember Grandma's deafening screams. It was the sound of someone dying in utterly overwhelming pain. It almost completely covered up the shivering, panting, and coughing from Grandpa before he passed. It only lasted a few seconds before it abruptly ended. Then, roots started to grow over and into their twisting corpses and attached themselves everywhere around and inside of them. The plants started to devour their innards, and their bodies now started to become empty as the trees grew into them like pots made out of their skin. My grandparents' inner parts were liquefied and completely emptied, while the stems, in a twisting manner, grew taller and broader. It seemed like they even fed from their bones, because it looked like they were emptied entirely afterward. I must have fainted after seeing this, because all I remember is waking up in my bed drenched in sweat. I looked around the room in a panic, and all I saw was my sweet sister, still sleeping in her bed. Still, to this day, it's hard for me to tell if it was a dream or not. I remember that the morning after this, the two Christmas trees had grown long and tall and stood proudly in the living room by an extinguished fireplace. Their bark was now deeply cracked, hellish, and resembled skin. The branches were contorted and limb-like. The green needles were now bent in strange configurations and had grown out hair-like. What initially looked like parts of skin under the trees now stretched up along the stem and twisted diagonally around the tree. If you inspected them closely, you could barely see something resembling a face. For some weird reason, the spruces now also carried fruit. The fruits were very thick and shaped like apples and had a dark cinnabar color with a meaty-looking texture with no skin. They were dripping some strange yellow, slimy gunk down on the wooden floor, and made the living room smell like a slaughterhouse full of mold. What horrified me the most, though, was not the horrifying view of my dead great-grandparents or this disgusting fruit. It was that my father made me and my sister eat these fruits after we had woken up that day. We had barely just woken up that morning, and Dad called us to go downstairs. Our mom stood in the doorway to the living room and just stared while my sister and I were crying. Dad was holding us down and forcing the meaty fruits down our throats. Of course, I understood it was something about those damn trees, but never would I have guessed what he was about to tell us and do to us in my wildest imagination. The fruits made my stomach turn. They tasted like salty blood and had a strong stinging sensation as I chewed them. As I bit down on the first one, I was expecting a crunchy apple-like texture, but it was like biting into a warm, raw egg. The inner liquids parts burned my throat as it went down, and I started to lose my voice. I cried out, but to no avail. My sister could barely keep it down and started to gag on the fruit, but she didn't dare to puke. My vision briefly blurred, and my ears started to ring, although I could still feel my body inside the living room. I could hear Grandma's voice again, and it felt like 1,000 screams that were being choked out and eventually silenced. I could also hear what I thought were the final thoughts of my grandfather, and he was so happy not to have to worry about this moment anymore. There was a flowing mess of flashbacks and vivid, undistorted memories from my childhood that I was way too young to be able to remember, that were seen from someone else's body. There is nothing as strange as feeling how it feels to hold yourself as a baby. This roller coaster of lucid visions, combined the disgusting taste of the fruits, made me so nauseous that I could do nothing else except barely sit up. After a while, when we somewhat calmed down and stopped crying, Dad spoke to us about what happened. And he said, "One day, you will understand, kids. When you get older, you will also start to contemplate the end of your lives when your mortal bodies begin reaching the end of their use. Your body and mind will age, get old, and then usually pain and discomfort start to set in. Eventually, you usually lose everything. Your mind will, at some point, become an empty husk with no past or future, no memories or reference left to center you back into this world, only mindless existence with nothing there, followed by certain death. But at that point, you are basically dead already. What you just ate was the red Yule fruit, and I just gave you and your sister a second chance to keep living after this brief and limited human experience has ended. The seeds within this fruit will take almost 60 years to cultivate inside of you fully, and will most likely spread into your husbands and wives as well, after which you will evolve together into the next stage of our collective existence. For centuries, our relatives have accumulated quite an extensive collection of life stories and lucid memories. Every 30 years, the assortment grows a little every time, and all you have to give up for this gift is the very last years of suffering for the prize of being able to witness and relive centuries of lives lived. Imagine being able to live out an almost infinite amount of past lives, and also sharing everything you've witnessed with the rest of us to experience as well. This is what is so special about our family. We will always be there together with each other. I'm sorry I had to do this to you, but understand that I will eventually live through all of this pain and discomfort you just experienced as well. So, in a way, we are already even." Father's words were strangely soothing to me at the moment. It calmed me a bit, considering the circumstances. I didn't understand a word he was saying. I was hearing his familiar voice speaking nonsense to me, and everything just seemed to make perfect sense and made me stop thinking about how utterly insane this situation was in reality. My mom was still standing in the doorway, listening to the same speech with lifeless emotion on her face, except for a faint, fake smile on her face. It felt to me like she was powerless to do anything about this, and just accepted this as our fate. She had wandered off to get dressed for the snow outside while Dad was talking to us. And she was standing there, dressed with a thick winter coat and holding 2 shovels in her hands. After all was said and done, they made us walk for hours into the forest, dragging both of the 2 repulsive trees behind us on a sled. We ventured past the ominous stone formation, far into the dark woodlands, and ended up where the warm, hellish pines grew tall, and we planted what was left of our grandparents into the frigid and icy snow-covered ground. It took a very long time, since the frost on the ground was so deep. Dad and I took turns digging out chunks of frozen soil for the hole. Then my mom and sister planted the damn things. We walked home afterwards in complete silence, and by that point, it was almost light outside. Those horrid and sadistic images I described have troubled me greatly for many years. I will never forget that vile taste in my mouth and the dreadful thoughts of never being able to leave this world. It still consumes me. I've been dreading the day that I'm being animated into one of those nasty things for decades. I haven't spoken to anyone about this since my parents went through their transformations together 30 years ago. My last dying wish is to inform you about the truth about this age-old Christmas tradition. And I'm leaving this as a warning for anyone reading my story. I've been feeling one of those awful things move inside of me for a couple of days now. I can only describe it as a rough scraping sensation, followed by a sharp, piercing pain. Yesterday, I went in for a full-body checkup, but they told me there was nothing wrong with me physically. They suggested it might be constipation or food poisoning, and that I should call them again if symptoms get any worse. Just this week, my wife started complaining about a stinging sensation in her abdomen as we were trying to sleep. I know this isn't just a coincidence, and there is no way I'm just going to let this happen to us. I know what you think. It is unfair and cruel toward my family, and I should have told my wife a long time ago. But I honestly don't think she would have believed me. I just wanted to forget all about it all and live everyday life. But now I know it's impossible. There is just over a week until the next winter solstice, and I'm not going to go through with the celebrations. My sister, her children, and the rest of my family expect me and my wife to host the next Red Yule together, but I refuse. I've made arrangements for my wife and me to pass tomorrow. Despite all of this, I love my wife and children with all my heart. I sent the children away to be with some of my close friends this year, so I desperately hope they don't have to live through what I have endured. As charming and innocent as those red balls on your Christmas tree may seem, I know of their true evil. If you ever happen to stumble upon snowless pines in the middle of northern winters, and in the unlikely event that they are carrying fruits, stay away and forget that you ever saw them. Goodbye.
Opal stared on helplessly as her friend burned to death in the cozy fireplace before her. Its mantle lined with stereotypically idyllic photographs of the black-haired, blue-eyed twins that had tormented them for the last and longest evening of their life. She struggled desperately against her manacles, but the iron chains weighed more than she did, and the Christmas tree they were attached to was so enormous and heavy with ornaments that it proved impossible to overturn. She tried to scream, beg, cry, anything, but all her vocalizations were incoherently muffled by the candy cane-striped gag in her mouth. Even were she not gagged, it was hard to imagine she could ever cry loud enough to be overheard over the agonized, dying screams of her friend as the fire devoured her whole, burning down through her flesh and out through her lungs as she inhaled the blaze. In a mix of terror and instinctive self-preservation, she thrashed against the cast-iron screen that imprisoned her within the fireplace. The female twin sadistically forced her back with a poking iron as the male sat smirking on the couch, content merely to watch. When the twin withdrew the iron, it carried a large chunk of smoldering flesh on its end. Opal nearly threw up in her gag when she saw the twin ravenously tear off about half the flesh with her teeth and devour it with a depraved relish before passing the rest to her brother for him to finish. Eventually, inevitably, and all too quickly, Opal watched her friend succumb to the fire, reduced to a charring and blackened corpse coiled up in a fetal position. Opal broke down and sobbed feebly as the female twin hung a kettle over the crackling carcass and went to replay a Christmas album on their mid-20th century record player. Opal turned her gaze to the snow-swept glass doors to what she assumed was a balcony. She briefly humored the notion of somehow severing her hands free of the manacles, kicking them to the cannibal twins as a distraction and making a break for it, but quickly thought better of it. Since no one had heard or heeded their desperate cries for help, there was either no one else around, or if there were, they were allied or subject to the twins. Opal had no idea where she was, or how high up she was, and how far could she really expect to get with a pair of hemorrhaging wrists. Still, after witnessing what they had done to her friend, it might be the most peaceful death she could hope for. When the kettle began to whistle, the female twin returned to retrieve it, using it to fill a pair of pre-garnished glass mugs that she set on the coffee table in front of her brother.
There we are, James darling. The perfect holiday drink. Extra strong hot toddies, she announced enthusiastically, a drunken drawl already present in her speech. All whiskey, no water. Fish fucking it, as Frankie used to say.
Affectionately cuddling up beside him, the twins clinked their glasses together in a toast before taking their first sips.
As always, Mary darling, your annual Christmas party has been a resounding success.
James congratulated her.
Well, I can't take all the credit. You rounded up the guests after all.
Mary returned the compliment, laughing as she gestured towards the corpse in the chimney.
It's a shame to waste all that meat, but it's a special occasion. As much as I love my knives, burning to death sure is one heck of a spectacle.
It surely is. One that'll be hard to top at any rate,
he added, his gaze drifting over to Opal.
How about an encore then?
I'm sorry, James darling, but I'm afraid we've reached that point in the festivities where my addiction to alcohol has triumphed over my addiction to violence and human flesh.
She apologized, while unapologetically taking a deep draught from her mug of hot whiskey.
No need to apologize, Mary darling. A balanced life means taking time to attend to all one's addictions,
he claimed.
Well put, James darling.
She agreed.
Besides, I'm awfully cozy cuddled up here beside you. Instead of getting up, how about we give this girl an environmental challenge? This time, I'll be the one who watches and you can work the control panel?
Sounds like a plan, Mary darling.
James nodded, putting down his drink and pulling out an antiquated-looking bronze keyboard covered in hundreds of switches, knobs, buttons, and faders.
Why don't you explain how this works to our guests while I get this set up?
Right. Listen up here, Ducky,
Mary said as she leaned in towards Opal.
Do you know the song that's playing right now? It's Baby It's Cold Outside. Now, I'm a bit of a shut-in, but I've heard that this song is a bit controversial these days. I don't know if it's just because I'm old-fashioned or because I'm rather predatory myself, but this is one of my favorite Christmas songs. It's also highly appropriate, since you're going to have to choose between braving the winter cold or staying inside with a dangerously depraved miscreant and her brother, who honestly isn't any better. He's just a bit more practiced in the social graces than I am. The choice might seem obvious at first, but you need to understand a little bit about where you are, though. You're inside our playroom, and we control everything in here. Everything. We can control it through sheer will when necessary, but my brother here has a bit of a knack for paratech and can make mechatronic controls that make the whole process much quicker and more precise. And outside the residence is still inside our playroom. So the choice isn't really between us and the cold. It's between the cold we control and taking us head on. You may not care for your odds in a fight with us, but keep in mind we do have one rather glaring Achilles heel. We're horrible drunks.
I don't think that's an entirely fair assessment, Mary darling. I've always considered you a perfectly lovely drunk.
James interjected.
Oh.
Mary cooed.
Well, whatever kind of drunk I am a drunk, and frankly, this pint of whiskey is going to my head faster than I expected. I'm likely to be nodding off momentarily, Ducky, so you'd honestly just have to slit my throat in my sleep to get past me. That is, if my brother wasn't sitting right here to protect me. Of the two of us, he's always been the more functional alcoholic. I certainly feel safe with him here, but the choice is yours.
Opal's manacles suddenly unlocked and clattered to the hardwood floor below. Wide-eyed, she looked towards her tormentors for any sign of what they intended to do next. Mary just took another long sip of whiskey, while James smirked at her with his finger hovering over a button on his control panel. It wasn't necessarily a rational decision, but facing the winter cold in only the tattered remnants of her clothes seemed like a safer option than just trying to get past the Darling twins and out their front door. Limping as quickly as she could, she bolted to the glass doors and out onto the balcony. She saw that she was several stories off the ground, and the landscape all around her was covered in freshly fallen snow. The air was cold but still, with fluffy snowflakes gently wafting downwards. This was odd since the sky was crystal clear and abundant with twinkling stars. Opal had no formal knowledge of astronomy and had not spent much time staring up at the night sky, but she could still tell at once that the stars were wrong. They were too bright, too regularly spaced, and were moving too quickly. Turning her attention back to the more prosaic matter of the ground, she saw that there was a snow-covered but plowed road leading straight ahead to the coniferous tree line and the lights of human habitation. It was the only sign of civilization she could see, and so she had little choice but to make for it. Looking over the edge of the balcony, she saw that a snowbank of soft and fluffy fresh snow had piled up directly underneath her. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to break her fall. She took one final look behind her and saw that the Darlings were still sitting on the couch. Mary had already polished off her pint of whiskey and had unsurprisingly lost consciousness. Her head rested upon her brother's shoulder as she snored loudly. James, on the other hand, was still wide awake. His eyes were trained on her like a cat watching a mouse. just waiting for her to run so that the chase could begin. Opal leaped off the balcony's edge and into the snow below without a second thought. She screamed as she was enveloped by the frigidly cold snow, but it successfully slowed her descent enough that her fall left her unharmed. Frantically, she tried to dig herself out before she suffocated, but the fluffy snow was so light that she was never in any danger of that. Within seconds, she was free, the plowed road and the possibility of escape laid out before her. Tearing the gag from her mouth and letting out hours' worth of screams built up all at once, she burst out into a sprint and raced to the village on the edge of the horizon. She ran as much as to keep warm as she did to escape from the Darlings, hoping that she could stave off frostbite long enough to get to some sort of shelter. She could already feel her toes starting to numb as they slammed against the packed snow beneath her. She could barely go more than a few seconds without checking to see if James was in pursuit, but she was otherwise mostly heedless of her surroundings. It took her a moment to notice that the street lamps that lined the road appeared to be made of ice, and that their lights were paradoxically brightly burning flames. Further up the road, she spotted what looked like humanoid figures lining its edges. Her first thought was, of course, that they were people, but almost immediately realized that that couldn't be true. They were all completely white as the snow around them. And so her next assumption was that they were snow or ice sculptures, or perhaps more permanent statues with a dusting of snow. She didn't dare to slow down to get a better look as she passed them, but she at least got close enough to see that they were made from ice, or rather, they had a veneer of ice. In the flickering light of the overhead fire, Opal could just faintly make out the distorted forms of hopefully dead bodies trapped inside. All of them were posed in a tableau of either Christmas or winter activities, from caroling to sledding to snowball fights. Opal didn't hesitate to pick up her pace and leave the ghoulish statues behind her, lest she share in their morbid fate. She was perhaps too reckless in her flight, as she finally lost her footing on the slippery snow and fell to the ground. The fall winded her, and the snow seemed to have gained an unnatural capacity for sucking the heat from her body. Shivering, she tried to right herself, but with every attempt, she just fell back down. The ground, which had moments before been packed with snow, was now pristine and virtually frictionless ice that proved impossible to stand on. Looking backwards towards the apartment building, she panicked at the sight of James skating towards her in a coat and toque. He deliberately held his hands behind his back so that she couldn't see what sort of weapon he was armed with. Abandoning any effort to get on her feet again, she instead began to drag herself across the road to the steep snowbanks that delineated it from the snowy landscape beyond. James would have to either chase her in his skates or his socks, giving her at least a chance of outrunning him.
Sorry, dear, but a laborious chase through the snow is a bit cliché for my tastes,
James shouted after her. Before she was able to get off the icy road, it began to tilt downwards, enough that she instantly found herself sliding forwards against her will. Screaming, she flailed her limbs about wildly as she tried to slow her descent. But it all proved utterly futile as she just kept picking up speed. Ahead of her, the road inverted its incline and turned upwards, forming a ramp that was sure to send her flying through the air and likely to her doom. She clawed desperately at the road as she slid down, but she succeeded only in ripping her nails from her cuticles. Faster and faster she went, until she was inevitably launched skyward in a prolonged parabolic arch, screaming hysterically as the already freezing cold air beat against her at speeds approaching hurricane velocities. James was right behind her, soaring through the air with the calm professional control of an Olympic skier. The two of them went over the tree line and into a small village of brightly lit gingerbread houses built around a frozen fountain in the circular town square. As Opal plummeted straight towards the fountain, she was certain she would splatter against it, and that would be the end of her. At the very last second, however, The ice phase-shifted back into water, or rather, anomalous water that lacked all surface tension. She plunged down deep into it, and it was the coldest thing she had ever felt, but she wasn't dead. She swam back to the surface and hauled herself out, huddling up against the fountain's basin as she tried to retain as much body heat as she could. She gradually became aware of the sound of skates cutting through ice. Looking up, she saw that James was doing laps around the fountain, having not only survived his fall, but landed unscathed with the elegance of a cat.
So, what do you think of our Christmas village?
He asked, as he circled her like a raptor circling its prey.
I was worried you wouldn't make it this far. Mary designed this place herself. It's always a big hit with the kids. Until they see what's inside, that is.
He skidded to a stop in front of her, taking his hands out from behind his back to reveal he was carrying a large and heavy-looking candy cane.
I'm going to give you 1 minute more, Opal,
he told her.
At the end of that minute, if you're still sitting here, I'll beat you to death with a novelty-sized candy cane. If, however, you'd like to continue to fight for your life, however futile it may seem, I won't stop you from running into one of these buildings to either hide or find something to defend yourself with. Starting now. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi.
Though she was shivering so badly it was hard to move, she forced herself to her feet and took a quick assessment of all the buildings around the town square. There was an inn, a shop, a post office, a town hall, a toy factory, a train station, and a chapel. The inn seemed the most likely to hold kitchen utensils, and the toy factory to have tools, both of which she could make into improvised weapons. The chapel, however, had a steeple, and she got the feeling that gravity might prove to be the best weapon she could defend herself with. If she could get herself into a defensible position, a well-timed and well-placed kick could be enough to send James tumbling down a flight of stairs or over the belfry. Grabbing hold of the fountain to steady herself, Opal hoisted herself back to her feet and took care to slide rather than walk over the frictionless ice toward the chapel. As James continued the count, she made her way up the steps as quickly as she could and pushed the gingerbread doors open as hard as possible. And when they swung open, she screamed. The inside was not made of candy and gingerbread, but was rather just an old church in a dangerous state of decay. Out of every crack and crevice seeped a caustic black fluid that flowed as slowly as molasses in January. It crept upwards along surfaces, against gravity, with great gelatinous blobs of the substance budding off and slowly rising upwards like wax in a lava lamp. It all collected upon the ceiling, where it formed into a mosaic of gauntly skeletal faces, jaws all held agape in silent screams to reveal multiple rows of rotten and malformed teeth. Their misplaced and supernumerary eyes and nostrils were nothing but abysmally cavernous voids, their hypercephalic craniums all bulging near to the point of bursting.
34, Mississippi. Oh, and do be careful of the black bile,
James warned.
It's a manifestation of the eldritch rascal that gives us our power. We have to expunge it from our bodies from time to time so we don't end up like our Uncle Larry. We keep it on this floor because it likes the cold. 35, Mississippi.
Tempting as it was to give up and just let James beat her to death with his candy cane, Opal forced herself to step into the bile-infested chapel. She could hear the faces in the ceiling breathing laboriously and out of sync with one another, but they didn't seem to react to her presence. The free-floating bile on the floor and in the air showed no change either. She ran up a short stairway to the mezzanine and then up the spiral staircase of the belfry. The staircase twisted around and around and climbed higher and higher, far higher than should have been possible. The higher she went, the more abundant the black bile became. She couldn't avoid stepping in it, and it clung to her feet and slowed her ascent. She couldn't avoid touching it, and she felt a dull, slow burn gnawing away at every inch of contaminated skin. She swatted the airborne blobs away as best she could, but some were so small she was sure she hadn't avoided inhaling them. She climbed for what felt like hundreds of steps, and peering down over the railing only confirmed that the tower was far taller now than it had been when she started. She braced herself up against the railing and began to weep, only moving again once she heard the sound of encroaching footsteps coming from below. Eventually, she reached the top of what she feared might be an infinite staircase and emerged out into the belfry. The tower now rose many stories above the ground, and she had no difficulty spotting the apartment building she had fled from in the distance. But that was all she could see. Other than that building, the Christmas village and the road between them, there was nothing but endless miles of pristinely white snow. Even if she somehow evaded James and his sister, and the black bile, and whatever other monstrosities inhabited this strange and nightmarish otherworld, there was no escape. If her death was unavoidable, she thought it would be better to jump and deny James the satisfaction of the kill. Still, it wasn't an easy thing to do. She hesitated, and that hesitation cost her the only chance she had in the matter.
60, Mississippi.
She reflexively spun around to see that James had silently caught up to her. Before she could react, he struck her across the face with his cane, delivering enough force to knock her over the belfry's railing. She plummeted down towards the hard, icy ground, and this time, there was nothing to break her fall. Back in the penthouse of their residence, James stood at the window smoking a cigarette as he admired his latest trophy.
Morning, James, darling.
Mary yawned as she made her morning beeline from their bedroom to their bar. As always, she was none the worse for wear after her consumption of a normally fatal amount of alcohol, and ready for more.
Are you all right with eggnog eye-openers for our morning cocktails?
After last night, I'm still very much in the Christmas spirit, Mary darling.
He agreed.
Well, sorry I passed out early. If I had paced myself with that hot toddy, I could have stayed up a bit longer. I don't know what came over me. I'm usually Mrs. Self-Control.
She laughed as she took a swig from the liquor bottle before mixing the drinks.
So after you put me to bed, you went running out after our last victim, right? I thought we were just going to let the cold finish her off.
I got an idea for what I wanted to do with the body, and I didn't want her losing any digits to frostbite before I could get to her,
James explained.
You know, if I were the jealous type, which I am, I might be a bit miffed that you went chasing after some stray harlot on your own.
She reprimanded him.
What exactly did you get up to last night?
Come see for yourself,
James invited, waving her over to the window. With their cocktails in hand, Mary sauntered over to her brother's side and peered out the window with cautious optimism. Outside, James had contracted the road so that the Christmas village was easily seen from their penthouse, and on top of the fountain stood Opal, encased in ice. He had poised her as a figure skater, standing on one leg with her arms outstretched for balance. Her frozen corpse reduced to a garden decoration to spruce up her killer's estate.
James, darling, I love it.
Mary swooned.
She's the perfect centerpiece for the Christmas village, and I can't imagine a more fitting fate. We told her it was cold outside, but she didn't listen. If only she'd known the exit to the playroom is out in the front lobby.
Merry Christmas, Mary darling,
James wished, taking his cocktail in one hand and putting the other around her waist.
Merry Christmas, James, darling,
Mary wished, kissing him fondly before taking her first sip of eggnog.
Drew parked in the grass to make sure he was leaving plenty of room for the rest of his family. There were far too many of them as far as he was concerned, and they would all be here. They never missed a Christmas or chance to make each other feel uncomfortable, no matter how much they hated the holiday. Drew thought that the only thing his family hated more than the holidays was each other. And still, year after year, they showed up to share that hate in the most passive-aggressive ways they could muster. Of course, he wasn't really one to talk since he had never missed one either, and he couldn't stand a single one of them. They weren't a likable bunch, and every time he had the displeasure of being around them, he wanted to resort to violence, and would often imagine their gruesome deaths in order to survive the holiday. He would smile and keep eye contact while picturing the chandelier falling onto his aunt's bouffant, or nod with feigned interest as he thought about kicking his uncle's badly fitting khaki ass into the oven. In reality, Drew wasn't the violent type, though. He didn't have the option to be. He was the yang to the Chuck Norris yin. He believed, all jokes aside, Chuck's beard probably could actually kick his ass. Drew got in one fight in 6th grade and he lost it badly. He was forced to find other ways to solve problems. In most walks of life, that consisted of talking his way out of things and negotiating, 2 skills that meant nothing in this family. No one listened to him or anyone else, or cared what anyone had to say past their own lips. Just thinking about it was infuriating. Drew took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then he made his way up the curved, cobbled walking path between rows of potted plants and pinwheels that spun lazily in the gentle breeze. "I'll be thankful when I don't have to deal with this shit anymore," he mumbled as he made his way to the front door. Drew saw the curtain to the left of the door move and felt his Aunt Clara staring at him like he was some kind of intruder, there to rob the place as she hid behind the Christmas red fabric. Yeah, because I'd ever come here of my own accord, he thought. The bomb-ass peach cobbler wouldn't even get me to come back if I didn't have to. Why did I have to? Mom. I always came for Mom. As horrible as these people consistently treated her, she has always put value on family. That's part of the reason why she is probably the only redeemable member of this shit clan. Drew waved at the window and then knocked on the door. It took an absurdly long amount of time for the door to open when he knew his aunt had been nearby peeping at him. He was mid-exasperated huff when it finally came open. There was Aunt Clara wearing a Cheshire cat grin that was only slightly more frightening than her ugly sweater. "Drew," she crooned. "Oh, I'm so glad you made it. Your mother would be so happy." "That's why I'm here," he said. What he didn't say was, "It's literally the only reason, and you should quit staring at everyone that walks up like they're here to steal your plastic Christmas tree that sheds razor needles. I literally hate you." Drew walked past Aunt Clara and entered the house. His Uncle Mike was sitting on the couch, beer in one hand, the other lost in his pants, watching a football game. Drew scowled. Is he just petting his beer gut or masturbating to first downs? It really could go either way. "Hey, Uncle Mike." "Game is garbage. Refs must have eaten too much turkey and fallen asleep out there for Christ's sake." "Okay then," Drew said, walking past him. He made his way to the kitchen where he was immediately punched in the arm. "Ow! Damn it!" "Sup, cousin? You want to get high and visit the land of misfit toys?" He laughed with pride at his own joke, and Drew felt the disgust rise like bile in the back of his throat. He watched the man as he continued to nod while he waited for a response, his smile never faltering. Drew took a deep breath and let it out very slowly to gain composure. No, I don't want to do that, Charlie. We're actually adults now." "Yeah, so? Suit yourself. I think your sister is upstairs. She'll get high with me. Maybe she'll even make out with me if I'm good." "You're related," Drew mumbled quietly, then more loudly, "Have fun." "I will. Watch me," Charlie said before running off. "I won't," Drew said as he passed through the kitchen. He headed for the sliding glass door that led to the back porch where he knew his mother would be, chain-smoking cigarettes to deal with the stress of being here. He was patted on the head, back, and arm several times on the way by various family members already deep in the drink. Every touch made him cringe, but as he was accustomed to, he didn't say anything. He just kept on walking. In the safety of his mind, his inner monologue wished them all a speedy demise. He opened the door and stepped out onto the polished wood porch lit by large, ornate tiki torches. He didn't realize how stuffy it had been in his aunt's house until he was back out in the fresh air. He took in deep lungfuls and relaxed some before moseying over to the steps where his mother sat dragging hard on a cigarette that she held between shaky fingers. "Hey, Ma," Drew said, taking a seat on the step beside her. His mother reached over and grabbed his hand, giving it a squeeze. "Hi, baby. Glad you could make it." "I don't understand why you come to these things," Drew said back. "I have to. We're family." Drew rolled his eyes. "These people have never treated us like family, Ma. You're miserable. You don't want to be here any more than I do. Why don't we go and have our own Christmas somewhere else? Literally, anywhere else." Before his mother could answer, a stocky blond guy walked over, adjusting his football jersey. "You two have entirely too little beer in your hands," he said, "because you have none." Did you really believe you needed to explain that? Drew thought. "Hello, Todd." Todd turned up a beer of his own. "So, how's work or whatever? Do you even know what I do for a living?" His mother squeezed his hand again. "Be nice," she said quietly. "Work is fine," Drew said then. "Yeah, cool. Me too," Todd said. "Cheers." He sipped his beer and walked off. A woman in her mid-50s, dressed like a movie star, sauntered over to them then. "Did you bring a dish? Everyone was supposed to bring a dish. You know your grandmama passed, and your granddad doesn't cook." "I'm sorry," Drew's mother said with a frown. "I've been stuck at the hospital all day, every day. I haven't had any time." "Do you think the rest of us don't have jobs, Teresa? Or do you think they're just not as hard or important as yours?" Drew remembered similar comments year after year, and not just from Marcia, from all of them. They thought they were better than his mother, better than him. "I think I want to stab you in the throat for talking to my mother like that," Drew thought. Behind his eyes, he pictured it, a dull butter knife punched through flesh and a fountain of blood spurting past his aunt's surprised gaze. It made him smile. "I brought broccoli au gratin," he said, earning his hand another squeeze from his mother. "Where'd you buy that from?" the woman asked. "I cooked it. I am an adult, Aunt Marcia. I live alone and actually eat every day. It's necessary to stay alive." She said. "Figured you would use your fancy job as an excuse to buy something cheap on the way here like your mother always did." Then she shrugged her shoulders and made her way back inside. "I need to say hello to your grandfather," Drew's mother said, stubbing out her cigarette and sticking the butt in her pocket. "The hell you do," said Drew. "You owe him nothing." His mother just met his eyes and frowned. Then she got up and walked inside. Drew sighed and got to his feet as well. A young woman was standing in front of him the moment he turned around, and he jumped, grabbing his chest. He almost toppled backwards down the steps in order not to run into her. Drew cussed and glared her way as he grabbed at the railing. "Sorry," she laughed. "Katie, Charlie was looking for you. Something about inbreeding." Drew's sister laughed again. "We're like second or third cousins or something. It's not that big of a deal. These things are easier to deal with if you have somebody to kiss." Drew's eyes widened. "You did? No, never mind. Okay, I really do need a drink." "Charlie has more butt if you want." "That's all right. Beer's fine. Whiskey is better," he thought. "Did you bring a dish? Aunt Marcia's being kind of hardcore about it." "I brought a bunch of cans of corn. It's something, right? Like Mom or whatever." "Right," Drew said, patting her arm supportively. Then he left her there to head back in. He wandered through the rooms of the house, ignoring people and waving at others until he found his grandfather. He was in his chair. He was always in his chair. If he ever did anything else, Drew wouldn't know who he was. "Happy Thanksgiving, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year," Drew said to the man who continued to stare out the window. Without so much as turning his head, the old man said, "You're no different than your mother. Go away. My May is gone, and she's the only one in this family I even liked." Drew nodded. Right. Well, it's good to see you. No, it's not. Drew chuffed and left the room, almost bumping into his cousin Tamara. Sorry, he said. Grandpa's even less of a people person than he used to be. Well, it's Christmas, Tamara told him. So let's try to be nice, okay? Sure, Drew said with a forced smile as he squeezed past her and moved down the hall. I'll be sweet as a sugar plum. Wait till you see the gift I brought. Drew headed back to the living room. When he crossed the threshold, his shoulders were seized forcefully and he thought for a moment that he was back in the 6th grade about to get bludgeoned publicly by Stephen Wachowski's meaty fists. Instead, his Uncle Mac was staring into his eyes. I don't think we have enough food. Marcia's gonna kill us all, boy. Is there a store still open? We need more food. Drew shook his head slowly. I have no idea. What do you want to buy? I don't know, man. I just don't want to sleep with one eye open. I'm sure it'll all work out, Drew said. You could do like my mom and not sleep at all because you're up all night crying after how shitty your family treated you. Drew kept the thought to himself and put on his best game show smile. Don't you have like some big paying career or something? Mac asked nervously. I mean, you could just buy Christmas dinner probably, right? Drew stared at him. In his mind, he thought, well, I don't gamble with my buddies and call it a career like you do. Out loud, he said, breathe, Uncle Mac. We're supposed to be feeling the Christmas spirit. That's what today is all about, right? Good tidings and good cheer. Tell that to someone who ain't married to a battle axe. Drew envisioned an actual battle axe cleaving his uncle's head off and sending it rolling across the floor to rest against the maroon cabinet filled with the good china. One by one, the plates fell and shattered. Drew chuckled to himself and noticed his uncle staring at him like he had gone mad. Mac released him with a shake of his head and turned to find someone else to solve his problem. Why don't you ask my mom to go run some errands for you after she worked a triple shift being equally as mistreated? He wanted to say, but he bit it back. I really want to get a drink, Drew said as his uncle walked away. If you need help with something, just let me know. Yeah, all right, his uncle said without looking back. Then he excitedly hurried off towards another family member. Jimmy, he shouted. Drew took a deep breath to remain calm and walked past the two big men now hugging. His cousin Trina saw him, smirked, and handed him a flask. Drew didn't even ask what was in it. He just took a gulp. Then he closed his eyes as the warmth of the liquor flowed through him. It's only a little poison, Trina said with a grin. I wouldn't even care at this point, Drew told her. Where's your dad? She asked, taking the flask back and sipping from it. Drew shrugged. Where are the hookers in this town? That'd be my guess. Trina laughed. Still snorting the Winter Wonderland like a champion, huh? What a winner. I always felt bad for your mom. You and me both, Drew said back. I considered killing him a few times. I hope he shows up before you give out your present. Me too. Remember not to eat the broccoli. I wouldn't eat that shit anyway. It smells like a fart. Drew smirked. Then a commotion pulled their attention towards the front door. What the hell is this? His Uncle Bill was shouting. Settle down, Bill. It's Christmas, for God's sake, said the man who had just entered, holding a tray of food in one hand and a black garbage bag full of jutting boxes in the other. I wish he would empty that bag and just smother him with it, Trina said quietly as they watched the scene unfold. Drew agreed. Aunt Marcia charged forward, pointing like she aimed to declare the newcomer was a witch. You calm down, Larry, she shouted. We said no presents. You can't just go rogue and do whatever the hell you feel like. He literally can, Drew said quietly to Trina, who laughed. He's like 50. There's too many chefs and not enough Indians in this family, Larry boomed. Here comes the racism, Trina said. It always shows up at some point. Drew turned from the scene and went to see what the alcohol situation was like. He selected a beer and handed one to Trina. Together they popped the tops. In the other room, the argument grew even more heated, several more voices joining in. Trina gulped from her bottle. I almost wore my rainbow shirt today, she said. You should have, Drew said, drinking some of his own beer. I'd be the most colorful black sheep in town. Drew smiled. I'm glad you're here with me, cuz. Trina's face lit up. Are you kidding me? I wouldn't miss this for the world. Drew grabbed another beer, opened it, and headed outside, Trina in tow, as the sound of breaking glass joined the shouts in the living room. You're not going to be sad? He asked as they emerged into the safety of the open air. Have you met me? I've been dreaming about this, like, literally. I wake up disappointed that it isn't real, but stoked that it will be. Drew smirked and shook his head. He looked over at his mother, who was standing to their left, leaning on the railing between two tiki torches, smoking as usual. And how do you feel? He asked. She took a long drag and exhaled a big plume of smoke with a sigh. I don't like it, Drew. I spent my life trying to gain these people's approval, especially his. You don't have to worry about that anymore, Ma. With or without this, that no longer matters, okay? Yeah, okay. She went back to her cigarette and stared off. I think it's starting to flurry. Maybe we'll have a white Christmas this year. You all right? Trina asked, touching Drew's arm. He looked down at her hand and then lifted his gaze to meet her eyes. He nodded. Yeah, I'm good. The back door slid open and Drew's Aunt Marcia poked her head out. What are you two doing out here? We're setting the table and getting the food ready. We could really use some help. You're not children anymore. You're both adults. Act like it and pull your weight. When she ducked back in, slamming the door hard enough to make the anxiety-driven Aunt Clara cry out with worry and plead to be more gentle, Drew and Trina looked at each other. And you thought I'd be sad? Trina said with a chuckle. That's my mother. Do you have any idea what it's like growing up with that woman? I have an idea, Drew said. Your father was so worried about her wrath earlier he had a death grip on my shoulders. I'm pretty sure I have a bruise. Impressive that you can be that big and that weak, isn't it? We should probably go. Drew nodded. He looked over at his mother. She frowned but waved him on. He took a deep breath and followed Trina back into the house, but not before turning his beer up. When he got inside, he saw his Uncle Jimmy reaching into the covered pan of broccoli. Drew gasped. It was imperative that they all had the broccoli at once. If he ate it before it was time, he would ruin everything. Drew lunged forward and slapped his uncle's hand. Jimmy glared at him with a fire in his eyes. Are you fucking kidding me? No, he's not kidding, Trina said, jumping in. You're not special, Uncle Jimmy. You can eat with everybody else. Jimmy turned his anger towards her. He trembled and stared for a moment, then spun away and stormed from the room. Drew had to fight, sighing with relief. Where do you think you're going? Where does he think he's going? Jimmy's wife, Diane, snapped, looking around for answers. She stormed out after her husband. You need to get in here and help like everybody else. Merry Christmas, Mike groaned. I'm surprised they were able to pry you off the couch, Drew's grandpa said to him. Game sucked anyway, Mike replied. Ref ball as always. I have literally never cared, Grandpa said, and Drew and Trina both covered their mouths to stifle their laughs. The hell are you laughing at? Snapped Mike's son, Brian. Be respectful. Because respect is something this family knows so much about, Drew thought, but out loud he said, Brian, hey, how's school? A blonde jumped in front of him and stared daggers at Drew. You act like he's a student. Brian is a physical education teacher and a highly respected member of the community. Drew stammered for a moment. Okay. Brian smacked his wife's arm. Why'd he do that? I said not to do that. I just think you deserve respect, just like you defended your father, or is that only for men? Marcia yelled. What are you all doing? Stop standing around. This is a Christmas dinner and needs to be right. Mom would have had it perfect. Get to work. That's the spirit, Trina laughed, grabbing a pan and heading into the dining room. Drew snatched up the broccoli before anyone else could touch it and quickly followed her. When they reached the enormous table of finished mahogany, Trina looked at him with a grin. Can't you just feel it in the air? I think it's actually worse than usual, Drew answered. I guess when Grandma passed, things fell into chaos. When she was around, holidays were passive-aggressive, and now They're just aggressive. Drew's mother gave a supportive smile and rubbed his back. They're jerks, but they don't deserve this, she said. It's not too late to change your mind. Yes, it is, Drew said. He looked away from her and hurried to the kitchen to grab something else. Before long, the table was set, the carols were playing, and everyone was seated. Drew's grandpa was seated at the head of the table as he had always been. Aunt Clara was seated beside him, the pom-pom nose on her sweater reindeer glistening in the light. She took Grandpa's old spotted hand and smiled at him. Why don't you say grace, Dad? Grace died with my May. Say it yourself. I just want some goddamn turkey. Trina spit her drink and her mother kicked her under the table. Drew didn't understand the tactic. It was loud and he felt it. Everyone knew what she did. She might as well have hit her in the open. Trina flipped her mother the bird and the table went quiet, all eyes on Marcia. Drew watched with anticipation, expecting his volatile aunt to blow her top, but instead, she took a deep breath and said, It's Christmas, and we're going to have a nice dinner. I'll say grace myself. The table remained quiet as she did just that. Then hands came from everywhere to grab and seize ladles and spatulas. Food was going every which way. Drew put some on his plate, but he did it absent-mindedly. His focus was on watching to make sure everybody took some broccoli. His cousin Tamara was the only one that didn't from what he saw. You're not going to try my broccoli? He asked her. I hate broccoli, always have, she said. It's not your usual broccoli, he said. It's au gratin. At least give it a try. I'll pass, she said. Drew frowned, but what could he do? It wasn't as if he could force the broccoli down her throat. He just hoped she didn't ruin everything. A glance over at Trina told him that she was feeling the same. They would deal with it when the time came. They would have to. Drew didn't want Tamara running to the police and putting them in danger. He planned it this way for a reason, to keep the carnage contained, to make sure that his family were the only ones to die. He picked up a forkful of sweet potato casserole and said loudly, Merry Christmas, everyone. Something changed then, as it did every year. These hateful, miserable people let it go for a moment. They wore genuine smiles. They talked and laughed and passed food to each other. Drew and Trina did their part and faked it just like they did every year, smiling and laughing with the others. It's all bullshit, Drew thought. They act like a holiday makes everything better, like they're no longer terrible people because they're eating Christmas dinner with Bing Crosby crooning in the background. Sorry, Bing, you can't save these people. No one can. In the middle of silent night, heads started to fall. One by one, faces collided with plates, splashing gravy and crushing corn, further mashing the potatoes. Tamara realized that something was wrong and dropped her fork. It clattered loudly. She looked around in a panic, her eyes landing on Drew, who smiled at her. Then the butt of a pistol cracked against the back of her skull and she crumbled. Tamara hit the table and her plate but kept going right out of her seat into a heap on the floor. Oops, said Trina with a giggle. That works better in the movies. Worked perfectly to me, Drew said with a shrug. He pushed his chair back and got to his feet. Leave it to Claire to put raisins in the sweet potato casserole. Disgusting. That was nice timing, by the way, Trina said, getting up from her seat as well. Did you plan that? What, Silent Night? No, pure coincidence. Just evidence that the universe is on our side. Maybe it's Christmas magic, said Drew. We're eliminating some names from the naughty list. Won't this just add us to the naughty list? Asked Trina with a grin. Worth it. Drew reached into his coat and retrieved a syringe. He held and walked around the table looking down at his unconscious family. Now, who should be the monsters and who should be the victims? He wondered. You definitely have to make my mom one of the monsters. She's halfway there already. Drew thought a moment and scrunched his face. Yeah, but on the other hand, she probably has the best chance of survival. Think about it. If anyone here is meaner than a monster, it's your mom. Trina gave a mock shiver. All the more reason. Can you imagine if she did make it through? The thought of having to still deal with her after this is terrifying. Drew bit his lip and mulled it over. Then he nodded. Fair enough. He walked over to where Marcia sat, her face in a mess of cranberry sauce of her own creation, and he stuck the syringe into her neck, emptying its contents. Who's next? I'd say if we want to make sure that none of them get out, we go with Uncle Jimmy. Add your little serum to his already fuming aggression, and it's bound to make for a wild party. Drew sighed. He shifted and stood with his hand on his hip. We're thinking of this completely differently. You want to see a slaughter, a quick and efficient bloodbath. I want to see them have hope, to fight back and believe they can win and die anyway. Jimmy as a victim gives them a better chance. Trina blinked several times. Wow, you are more fucked than me. I had no idea until this moment. All right, we'll do it your way. How about we do the opposite then and make a monster out of the least threatening person? Stick Grandpa, or better yet, Charlie. Drew tapped his finger on his lip. Grandpa would be a more intense monster than you realize, I think. What about goofy-ass Todd? Or Uncle Mike? He'll just be like, rawr, football. The two shared a laugh together. Or your sister. I kind of want to see Uncle Mike face off with one of the monsters. If he loses, he'll blame the refs. They both laughed again. All right, I'll stick Charlie. Drew walked around to Charlie's seat. He saw that his cousin had an erection when he passed out with a wad of turkey stuck to the fork he still clutched. Katie was seated next to him, her face in the mushy, mushroomy goodness that was green bean casserole, and her hand was draped over his thigh. "Aw, come on," Drew shouted. "For God's sake, gross!" Took a second syringe from inside his coat and stuck Charlie quickly, moved his sister's hand to let it hang at her side, and then hurried away. "One more," he said. Trina was chuckling and trying to fight it. "I'm sorry," she managed between laughs. "Our family is just so fucked." Who should be the last? Drew asked, trying to stay on subject. "Haven't you done enough?" his mother asked him. "Leave it, Drew. Don't do any more." "What are you still doing here?" Drew asked. "You need to go." His mother just frowned and sauntered off towards the kitchen. Drew shook his head. Trina rounded the table and put a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Stick Aunt Clara," she said quietly by his ear. "She's afraid of everything, and the idea of the ugly sweater queen going full brutal is honestly awesome." Drew smiled then. "You're absolutely right." He walked over to Clara and gave her the injection. "Now we just have to wait for them all to wake up. Turn up the music." Trina took a swig from her flask and danced her way to the stereo, waving the gun in her hand. She turned the volume knob, and Drew started dancing as well. Together they sang and danced to all the classic holiday favorites. They broke open the champagne that was meant for later, shouting and laughing as the pop cork flew across the room to shatter an age-old ceramic decoration. They drank and danced until they were sore and out of breath. Then they stopped, panting and smiling at each other. Over at the table they heard a groan. "Perfect timing again," Trina said. Drew hurried over and stopped the music. The house fell into an almost tangible silence that was broken only by the stirring and moaning of their waking family. Trina went and stood by the door. Drew climbed up onto the table and stood right in the open chest cavity of the turkey. "Listen up," he said. "We only have time for me to explain this once." "Did you do this?" Brian growled. "Who the hell—" "Shut it," Drew said. "You all need to listen now. Year after year I've watched and listened to the way you treated my mother." "Your mother is dead," snapped Marcia. "She cared more about that damn hospital than her family. She gave it everything and it killed her." Drew stomped his foot down, making plates jump and rattle. "She did give her everything to her job, to taking care of the sick, and still, she tried so damned hard to earn your favor, and never, ever did. Even now, listen to you. You make me sick." "Too bad Nurse Mommy isn't still around to make you better then, huh?" said Jimmy. Drew wanted to kick him in the face, but he knew it would be a bad move. Jimmy would wallop him good unless Trina shot him, and that wasn't how this was supposed to go. He took a deep breath to try and steady his nerves, and then he said, I know none of you care enough to know what I do for a living, but I work for a very powerful company creating a new biotechnology. I brought our newest here today. I know we weren't supposed to bring gifts, but I couldn't resist. The hell are you talking about? His grandpa snarkily asked. You some kind of terrorist? You anthrax us on Christmas? Drew laughed. Better, he said. In another couple of minutes, 3 of you are going to change. You won't be yourselves anymore or remember who you were or who you loved. You will only know hunger and bloodlust. The rest of you? Well, you're screwed. Good luck. Drew hurdled his grandpa to hop down from the table. Forget this, said Brian. He shoved his chair back and stood. I'm leaving. He glared at his wife and commanded, Come on. But she didn't move. She looked terrified, and Drew loved it. No one is leaving, Trina said from over by the door. If you try to, I will shoot you. Please don't doubt me. Faces turned towards the kitchen, but Drew was now standing in the doorway waving a gun of his own. This is insane, said Jimmy's wife, Diane. What is this all about? Just making a little boy's Christmas wish finally come true, Drew answered. Clara's arm shot out and smacked the table. She moaned and her body twisted. Bones snapped and flesh stretched with a shrill squeak to fit her new skeleton. What the hell? Shouted Brian as he turned towards the front door once more. Trina pointed the gun at him. Brian shook his head. Hell no, I don't care. He looked back as Marcia and Charlie began to contort and change as well with the sounds of popping joints and tearing flesh, and he shook his head again. When he looked back at Trina, he said, Nope, shoot me. He took one step before Trina said, Okay, and did as he asked. The bang was loud and the bullet went right through his thigh, dropping him to the shag carpet. He cried out, and so did his wife. The rest watched in stunned silence. I didn't say I'd kill you, Trina told them. I said I'd shoot you. Claire and the others will be the ones to kill you. I will just make sure you can't run away. The chaos was what Drew needed. He ran out the back door. When he did, he applied a padlock and tugged the door to make sure it was secure. There was no way to stop them from trying to climb out the window, but he believed they wouldn't make it that far. He ran around to the front of the house to go in and stand beside his cousins so they could watch the destruction of their family together, but he stopped when he was hit by a snowflake. Drew smiled and held out his hand, letting the small flakes fall into his palm. He stuck out his tongue so he could catch them as they drifted from the pale sky. He took a deep breath then, breathing out plumes of steam, and said, Merry Christmas, Ma. Then he ran up to the front door of the house and tore it open. He jumped inside and immediately slammed it closed because he didn't know what might be trying to get out. What he actually saw made him laugh with amazement. The Christmas tree was down. The dining room table was overturned. Chairs were being swung as weapons, while the now lupine Marcia and Charlie leaped off walls and swiped with clawed hands at the people they loved. Giant wolf jaws snapped and sprayed spittle. Everyone was screaming. And there, right there in front of Drew, sweet paranoid Aunt Clara was eating the wounded Brian, tearing into his midsection, chewing the meat, and throwing aside the guts and bits she didn't want. Mouth agape, Drew looked at Trina. She smiled back at him. It's magnificent, she said. Drew just nodded. He was in awe. It was more than he ever could have hoped for. He only wished that his drunken, useless father had shown up for the party. Jimmy leaped on the wolf Marcia's back and started punching at her head. Trina hooted. Then she noticed Tamara under the table and gestured towards her with the gun in her hand. Drew glanced that way and frowned. She had been sufficiently chewed on, her intestines strung about like garland for the tree. I feel like we didn't give her a fair chance, Drew said. She chose not to eat the broccoli. That's on her, Trina answered with a shrug. Can you believe Brian's wife is over here and not running? Drew looked down and saw the sobbing woman reaching out towards her husband who had long since left this world. Monster Clara would glance over and she would pull her arm back, but she couldn't seem to bring herself to leave her husband's side. She must have really loved him, Drew said. I wonder what that's like, Trina said thoughtfully. Mom could tell you if she was here, Drew thought. She was the most loving person of all. Love doesn't get you anywhere but hurt, though, does it? Just as he thought it, Clara looked up at them, judged their guns to be a threat, and leaped onto Brian's wife, who gave a short, pointless scream before her throat was removed and Christmassy red was splashed over the fallen green tree. Mike joined Jimmy in trying to take down Trina's mom. Her husband, Mac, actually started trying to pull them off. "That thing is still my wife!" he cried. Trina laughed and Drew just shook his head. Charlie was making quick work of the others, claws and jaws tearing through their family. Drew's sister, who had been fond of Charlie earlier, was now screaming and throwing Christmas balls at him. He would swat them down with his claws or catch them in his enormous maw and crunch them between his jagged teeth. Trina started singing, "Deck the halls with blood of family, fa la 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 la, la 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 la." Their attention was drawn from the battle as Aunt Clara left Brian's now headless wife to leap their way. She must have decided the guns weren't scary enough to avoid. Trina raised hers anyway, but Drew pushed her hand down with his own. He grabbed a whistle hanging around his neck and blew into it. The wolf fell in mid-jump and whimpered in pain. Then it scurried away, still whimpering. "Holy shit! I didn't even hear anything," Trina said with a shocked laugh. "It's like an extreme dog whistle. Humans can't hear it, but the pitch is extremely painful to the monsters." Trina laughed. "So you can totally keep them when this is over and train them? You can make my mom go fetch your morning paper from a terrified paperboy?" She laughed hysterically at this. "Nah," Drew said. "It's temporary. It will wear off eventually and they will return to their original forms." "And they won't, turn back at the next full moon?" "No, it's a drug, Trina. They would have to administer more to turn again." "Holy shit," Trina said. "Mom's on wear crack and you have the coolest job ever." Drew laughed and blushed. "I can only imagine what this formula is actually going to be used for when it makes it to the prospective buyers." "Does that bother you?" "I try not to think about it. They actually know I'm here doing this." Trina's eyes widened. She stared over at him as Jimmy flew by, crashing into a painting of a frozen lake that hung upon the wall. "You're kidding me," she said. "Nope, they're taking it as a field test. When it's over, it will be cleaned and erased. The neighbors have already been removed." "Jesus," said Trina. "They didn't do anything to us." "Collateral damage and whatnot." "Damn, that's cold." She turned her head. "Dude, look at Grandpa." Drew turned and gulped. Sitting right in the middle of the transpiring horror was his grandfather. The table had been overturned, but the old man remained in his chair at what would have been the head of the table. People were screaming and running around him, flying by him and falling past him. Their blood sprayed his pinstriped button-down and darkened his green suspenders. He just sat there, staring forward, his eyes like knives pointed at Drew and Trina. Drew looked away. He was glad he did. Charlie was charging towards them, wolf jaws opened wide and strands of spittle like tinsel hanging from its loose lips. The blinking Christmas lights flashed in colors over his fur. Drew fumbled for the whistle, and Charlie made it close enough that he could taste the monster's foul breath before the sound only the beast could hear drove it away. Drew shivered. "That was close," he said. Trina didn't answer. Drew turned her way and saw her own mother ripping at her like she was the wrapping paper hiding away the present the beast had been waiting for, shreds flying in every direction. "Damn it, Marcia," Drew said with a snarl of his own. "You ruin everything, you insufferable beast." The wolf looked up from her daughter's mangled body, its eyes blazing with fury. "Go to hell," Drew said. He didn't bother with the whistle. Instead, he lifted his gun and squeezed the trigger. There was one short yelp and the wolf's brains were scattered over a family of decorative snowmen. "What did you do?" Max screamed, punching Drew in the jaw with a meaty fist. Drew crashed into the door, seeing stars. "She killed your daughter!" Drew cried as the next fist came and collided with his temple, causing a pounding headache instantly. "You killed us all!" Max screamed back. "You're as terrible as your useless mother!" There was a bang and Mac fell to his knees, clutching his abdomen as his innards spilled past his thick fingers. Drew didn't think he pulled the trigger. Then he felt a draft and realized the door behind him was open. He turned and found his father on the stoop. He was standing in the increasingly downpouring snow, holding a smoking gun. His clothes were twisted and disheveled, his hair a mess. He looked like he hadn't shaved in weeks, and he stunk of booze and sex. Dad? Duck. Drew dropped down and covered his throbbing head. His father raised his gun and fired again. Drew couldn't resist looking back and peeked over his shoulder in time to see Jimmy's wife, Diane, wielding the turkey carving knife. The bullet threw her backwards. She spun in the air before landing face down in a pile of someone else's insides. Drew turned back and looked up at his father. Don't you want to know what's going on? His father gave a lethargic shrug of his shoulders. Don't really care. Always hated these people and how they treated your mother. Drew felt angry then. He got back to his feet and glared at his father. You didn't treat her much better. His father gave a subtle nod. I know. That's why I planned to wait for the cops when I was done. Drew's eyes widened. His lips moved for a moment before he found the words. Wait, you were coming here to kill them? The slight nod came again. I've been thinking about it for months. I wish you had let me. Kept yourself out of trouble. You deserve better. Drew blinked. He didn't know what to say. He turned back towards the inside of the house and found it eerily quiet. There were limbs and gore and broken furniture everywhere. Marshall wasn't the only dead wolf. Charlie was sitting up against the overturned table, Christmas light strands wrapped tightly around his neck, his eyes bulging out of his lupine skull. There was a knife in his chest for extra assurance. His tongue lolled out of his long open jaws. Drew's gaze searched the room. Aunt Clara was still around somewhere. As he looked over the grisly details of the scene, his father stepping into the house beside him, Drew felt a lump rise in his throat that he had trouble swallowing. His grandfather's chair was now empty. Did Clara take him, or did he get up and go somewhere on his own? Drew wondered. He didn't know why he was so afraid of the old man. He barely moved. How much of a threat could he be? Come on, he said to his father. He stepped over Brian's remains and slipped on a still beating heart. His father caught him at the elbow. You made a pretty good mess here, he said. I've got cleaners. You have cleaners? His father said quietly, more to himself than actually looking for an answer. Maybe he was finally realizing that he didn't know shit about his own son. Too late now, Dad. Drew made his way to the kitchen and found that poor Todd had tried to get out the window. His back half was still there, spine protruding like a small pitiful Christmas tree in a pot that was far too big for it. Drew assumed the rest was in the yard beyond the wall. Behind him, he could hear his father vomiting and adding to the mess. He couldn't help but smirk. Sorry, his father said. It's not the sight, it's the smell. I could taste it. Drew turned to tell him it was okay when something wet dripped on his face. It smelled like stale breath. He wiped it away with a disgusted grimace on his face and then looked up. Clara was on the ceiling, claws dug into the plaster to hold her there. Her open jaws dripped drool. Another gob hit Drew in the face and he groaned. His father looked up and his eyes widened in terror. Drew was looking down, wiping saliva from his eye when Clara dropped. He felt the monster's looming presence rather than saw it, and when he looked up, she was already landing on his father. The old man's gun went off and a puff of fur exploded into Drew's face. He coughed on it and swatted at the air. The shot wasn't enough and lupine jaws closed on his father's face, giant razored teeth pushing through each cheek until they met in the middle. Bones crunched as she chewed. Drew raised his gun, but he didn't fire. His eyes caught the clock on the wall and he sighed. Another minute, Dad, and you would have been fine, he thought. As the wolf pulled its jaws from Drew's father's crushed head and turned to face her creator, her body cracked and twisted with snaps and pops. Fur fell away in clumps, and Drew saw what he found to be the most disturbing thing he had looked at all night. His Aunt Clara naked. He winced and tried not to look at her private bits. Clara stared at her hands. She wiped at her mouth and started spitting on the floor. What have I done? She cried. What have you made me do? Drew was still watching Aunt Clara's pitiful display, so he didn't take notice of the pantry doors coming open until his grandfather was already upon him. His mouth fell open and his eyes widened as the blade pushed into his back. The pain was intense and the gun fell from his hand to clatter on the floor. He kicked it away so the crying Clara wouldn't grab it and shoot him with his own weapon. My May was the only person in this family worth a damn, and God took her from me, his grandfather said into his ear. Drew felt the knife twist inside him and he screamed. Then there was a loud bang and he felt the knife stop moving. A second pop came and Clara fell still on the wet kitchen floor. Drew fell to his knees and then his side, beside her. He saw his grandfather laying on the floor as well, a large cavernous hole between his hateful eyes. "Get a medic in here. The doctor is down," a voice said. Drew looked up, still wincing at the pain in his back and gut. He saw flashes like blinking Christmas lights and felt like he was going to lose consciousness. Silently, he begged himself to hold on. There was a man in an expensive black business suit holding a gun. He was speaking into a Bluetooth headset. Behind the man, there was a crowd of people in white suits with face shields. They had buckets and mops and bottles of spray and immediately got to work. The man looked down at Drew and placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, we're going to take care of you, Doctor," he said with a smile. "You're way too important to lose. Just relax. Help is on the way." Drew watched through his waning vision as the man patted his shoulder and then stood upright. Speaking into his headset, he said, "Yes, sir, it was a success. We can contact the buyers and tell them it's a go." "Of course, sir. We'll clean it top to bottom and then burn it. See you soon, sir." He did well. Drew tried to sit up, but it hurt too much. He laid back down just as a man and a woman ran in and squatted beside him. "Take care of him. Do whatever you need to, but don't lose him," the man in the suit said to them. Then he looked at Drew and gave him another big smile. "Merry Christmas, Doctor," he said. "This is a Merry Christmas indeed."
Something is wrong with Slaytown. Roni knew that much about it. During the pre-COVID era of 2018, I was hired as a night security guard for a park in our town, right on the cusp of December. Since its grand opening in the 70s, the Acres were established as a Christmas theme park, scaled for locals and out-of-towners. Once nothing but a spread of wilderness along the Adirondack Mountains, now a scenic village where it was always holly and jolly. A place called Slaytown. From beyond the frosty gates, old iron lampposts guide you along a narrow path until you've reached a picture-perfect view of the 19th century. Crossroads glazed with cobblestone, shops with busy dormer windows, icicles hanging from powder-bleached roofs, smoke curling out of the chimneys. Cheery music pipes through the park's speakers, accompanied by a few carolers with warm mittens and blood-flushed faces. A horse, black as soot, clamps down Candy Cane Lane with a carriage of parents and happy, laughing children. Hot cocoa and ginger snaps linger in the air. And every night, as I pulled into the lot, the park had already fallen back to a brisk winter stillness. Despite the attempts to condition myself with day naps and blackout curtains, I always arrived feeling unrested. A plaque welcomed me at the gate, adding frozen peppermint letters, "Mix and mingle, jingle and crinkle." Hands buried in my jacket, I entered the gate and crunched up the grimy cobbles. I took a stroll past all the closed shops, only stopping to pick up a crinkled bag of candy left either by a child or an apathetic adult. I am watched by a set of fiberglass reindeer and lonely-eyed elves from the souvenir shop. As I reached the office building, I walked the short hall to my office, where I would spend most of my time. When I'm not making the periodic checks around the property, I am bodying a chair and desk, focused more on my college work than the cameras. Christmas comes early for the Dax. A framed news article sits between two landscape paintings celebrating Slaytown's opening day in the front lobby. The old ink reads, different screens show what the park's security cameras pick up on a large monitor. The pale streak of the parking lot, the lifeless booths and eateries, and of course, the many sculptures of Whimsy Way. That was the focal point for Slaytown, a trail that cut through the overlapping pines and curved back to the park in a horseshoe pattern. Large and small sculptures practically danced out of the thickets in a Yuletide merge of wonderment and nature along the mile-long footpath. Ice carvings dazzled with LED lighting, gingerbread cottages the size of sheds, poly-resin elves clasping hands together, and, naturally, who could possibly forget the reindeer? Nearly life-sized, the bucks emerge from the growth in cast-iron bodies and recycled scrap, hand-sculpted from a Brazilian artist. Due to the widening spread of homeless encampments around the vicinity and far too many incidents of drifters sleeping in the decorative cottages, the park hired out a security firm to keep them out, especially during the colder seasons. On the desk of my little office, I kept a note from Roni, the previous security guard. A sort of study guide he'd left me before his send-off. Admittedly, my impression of him wasn't the best when we first met. He was pale-faced, with a curly, gray-flecked chin, had eyes with as much life as an ashtray, and his gums, in a manner of speaking, were on the scurvy side. Despite the off-putting start, he ended up being a pretty nice guy, all sunny and full of talk all the time. Boy, did he like to talk. When I told him this was my first security gig, he gained permission to stick around a few shifts to show me the ropes. It was likely to make sure his replacement was up to snuff, but I felt that he also thrived on some new company. His list comprised the checkpoint system he'd made for night patrols around the park, most notably all the problem areas outside camera surveillance. As we walked and talked those few times, I'd sometimes catch the second-hand whiff of oily breath and body odor. Personal hygiene did not make it onto Roni's list. At 2 a.m., it was time for patrol. I grabbed my thermos and walked the usual route around the park, factoring in a piss when I reached Whimsy Way. Always hit there for some reason. Santa's out. The sign outside the workshop read while an anorexically thin Santa stood next to it, carved out of 6-foot mahogany. Its eyes were too faded to see, and its once rosy cheeks were stuffed with black dots closer to tooth black. And on the face of it, Slaytown was like every other Christmas-oriented park where your parents brought you to gaze at warm lights, make snow angels, and meet Kris Kringle himself. But as you linger just a little bit longer in this place, you begin to notice all the irregularities it has, the pint-sized creases in its image. The way particular lights always stuttered in and out, but seldom ever got fixed. The ever-thickening rust forming on the play area equipment every season. The squeals of the carriage grow worse as the tortured screws struggle to keep the wheels in place. According to Roni, it was no secret that the park was experiencing non-stop financial troubles. In fact, since gaining traction from the late 70s to the early 90s, Slaytown had gone from a subtle decline to a slow and steady bleed out in the 21st century. Although the families came back every year to purchase souvenir mugs and take-home trinkets, sustaining a park in a remote part of the state was becoming less feasible. Even as it attempted to remain open as a year-round resort for mountain bikers and horse riders, ends were still not being met. Inaccessibility from further out city areas had limited the park's reach for newcomers, because bills were expensive and Santa's stockings were thinning. But despite the location factor, the biggest hurdle in its path were the incidents that kept occurring. On November 19th, 1997, a scream erupted from the line of guests waiting for their picture with Santa Claus. The disturbance had come from Norma Redding, a woman in her 70s, just a few spots away from it being her granddaughter's turn. Out of the blue, she'd thrown her body back in terror, jostling the family behind her and letting out an ear-splitting shriek, the color draining from her face. When finally calmed down enough, she claimed that the sacks behind Santa's chair were not full of toys or sprawling letters, but of bones. Human bones, all stacked and tumbling out of the bag's contents. She stated she could smell the dark, dry blood flaking off of them, and she could hear the clickety-clack of their hollow bodies rattling against one another. But the worst of it, she mentioned, was the raw skull that replaced Santa's face, gnarled and grinning toward her. The complaints, however severe, did not hold much water to them, and were deemed as an older woman's eyes playing tricks on her, concluded with a free photo and discount voucher for the gift shop. Then, in 2005, December 15th, another disturbance happened, this time earning Slaytown a new spot in the paper. Child suffers seizure in Santa's workshop. Max Barrett, one of the many children who visited the park that day, was in a section of the workshop where kids could occupy a seat and write a letter to Santa, hand-delivering it to him as they had their photos snapped. As he sat at the desk and put the finishing touches on his letter, he would later tell the EMT that he felt something strange, like a cold, rasping breath running down his neck. Then, as he looked up and toward the front room, he saw his name on the wall. "Hi, Max," scrawled in wet, bleeding letters. His parents rushed to his aid, and when the episode had passed, he was checked over and cleared by a paramedic. Another unexplained occurrence, and although a potential lawsuit had nothing to sink its teeth into, the damage to the image of the park was done. It makes you wonder how many others had seen something in this place, a slight terror in their peripheral they chose not to double take or speak up. Something that made them not come back again. Which brings me to the most particular note from Roni's list. Always count the reindeer. "What's the deal with this one?" I asked him, as dawn arrived to conclude our final time together. "Something you should do every shift, just in case," he answered, pausing a moment to pull on his coat. "In case of what?" His response was short as he beamed those ulcered gums. "Reindeer games." On the way back to the parking lot, I asked what he meant by that, and surprisingly, the man so full of talk had little else to share. A wrought iron gate presented the entrance to Whimsy Way, standing 8 feet tall and glassed over with ice. A lonely sprig of mistletoe hung from its span. Beyond it, the fleecy white trail narrowed and vanished into the dark bulk of woods where imagination was waiting. After a quick piss, I trudged on, whistling out in foggy puffs. Once taut in the spring, the trees now sagged drunkenly downward by the snow gripping their branches. From out of the covered pines, the first work of art emerged with a series of white snowmen heads stacked over each other in a totem-like fashion, all graced with glassy eyes and black pebble smiles. Slightly further down, there was a row of Christmas trees shaped out of corrugated metal and sprayed with a dark green finish. Near them, a larger-than-life nutcracker stood tall, with an axe in its hand and a frosty beard hanging from its articulated jaw. As the trail began its wide loop, I came across a small gingerbread hut nestled just off the paved track. Its roof was glossy, with decorative frosting, and shingled with fist-sized gumdrops. A single bite mark, left by either Hansel or Gretel, was fashioned out of its candy-crusted side. In its small yard, a tall iron reindeer stared blankly toward me. Tangles of unlit Christmas lights coiled around its body. Stepping off the path, I shined a light through the sugar-lined window, saw that no one was home, and plodded further down the trail. A sharp drift kicked up and scraped my cheeks. I took a strong gulp from the thermos to warm my throat. Coffee, a bit of cream, and just a tinge of love from my pocket. There were even more reindeer on this part of the trail. One crouched under a tree, two battling with locked antlers, another bent over to munch some non-existent grass, and one more prancing in sheer cervine delight. I never bothered to count them, as Roni's list had instructed, as there didn't feel like any point behind it. Maybe it was just a tip to keep me focused during the shift, to keep all my senses honed. On the other hand, I figured it was also a way to screw with the new guy. Then I heard a sound behind me. My eyes darted back and then all around, seeing nothing but the sculptures and slumping thickets. Probably just some snow clump was falling off a branch and slapping the powder below. I was alone, as I had been dozens of times, thumping up and down this trail. So, why was there now a shakiness in my legs? An absolute dread creeping around my chest. I let out a breath, not realizing how long it had been trapped, and began walking faster. The sound came again, this time with more definition. Something like a whine. I stopped and looked back again, waving my flashlight around. Still nothing, but that wasn't true. Something was different. Off-kilter. My eyes wandered to each stock-still reindeer, unconsciously tallying them up. 2 standing, 2 fighting, 1 prancing. But hadn't one been curled up under the tree? I took a few paces back to check. It was the same spot, but the sculpture beneath stood high on its legs, facing the trail. I walked around the tree, checking for the resting deer on the other side, but there was just the one, as though it had just stood up from its patch. Even the clashing reindeer looked different now, one bowing lower to the ground than it had been before. The chills were getting to me, making me doubt myself. Reindeer games. Roni's voice echoed in my skull, which immediately shoved away. I felt congested. My throat rubbed raw from the cold. My mouth somehow both dry and slimy. I pulled back another swig from the thermos, only to hack it all out as the sound returned, this time much louder and sharper. A grating, screeching sound, much like a squeaky swing at a playground. The thermos slipped from my grip and plopped at my feet, spreading a dark stain through the snow. I wiped a glove over my mouth, still coughing and gasping until my lungs settled. Then, as I ventured another look around, I just as quickly wished I hadn't, because there was nothing to doubt what I was seeing out there, all alone amidst the trees. The scene around me had changed entirely. The happy reindeer was no longer prancing, but holding its head low and toward me, like it meant to charge, one hoof raised and looking ready to slam back down, while one of the 2 fighting reindeer still held its original posture, The other had adopted a sort of strut closer to the path. Even the one behind them was no longer in its make-believe forage, but drawing its head high for a loud, wailing bugle. And to bring the madness to its peak, a new one had joined the fray. The reindeer I passed earlier, the one dazzled with Christmas lights, was now on the path just a few short hops away from me, a single red bulb stuttering in and out over its face. I strained my eyes shut and forced them back open. The sculptures were all still there, occupying their new spaces. An urge to run fired off in my legs, but instead came out as a steady walk backward, my eyes tracing everything and everywhere. It came again, the screech of disgruntled metal right up my left side. It was so loud, so close. I thought my life had just ended. One of the creature's metal faces peered out from a nearby tree. Once resting under the tree, the reindeer had advanced all the way up the side of the path to here. I'd taken my eyes off it for not even a second before it pulled closer. Was this an attempt to flank me? To block my escape? That's what it was. A game of red light, green light. Simple rules. Unknown stakes. The sound flared again, making my heart jolt painfully. Had I missed one? My eyes shot around, running a quick, unthinking check. Then, when I shined my light back to the deer peeping out from the tree, I saw its eyes. Not the smooth hemispheres of iron-rich inlay, but wet, reflecting lenses. Round and blued by winter. It was not just the placement of the reindeer that changed. That would be too merciful. The reindeer on the path, with its blinking red face, was now hunched wickedly forward. Its mouth peeled back into a terrible sneer of teeth, sharper than any caribou should have. The others had changed too, drawing closer in frozen approach. Their bodies were no longer silvery gray, but scarred with yellow-brown rust. Cirrus clouds air out of their nostrils, black salivating tongues dangling out of their far too open mouths. The world was getting smaller, condensing all around me at a slow but sure pace, like a dark force closing in on all sides, inching ever closer and demanding its existence, feasting on the thing I once considered reality. At that moment, for whatever reason in the world, I recalled something Roni had asked me during patrol, walking this same route. What do you think this place was back then? I mean, like before Santa came to town. What do you think was here first? I didn't have an answer for him, and as he asked this, I recall seeing his eyes scan over the tree line, perhaps not just admiring the art. I was paralyzed, too afraid to even blink, the cold clenching around my eyes as they rolled from one contaminated form to another. The sculptures would be primed for that horrible sound, just waiting to come again if I didn't move. Then, before it could, I tore my gaze away and started running. I hurtled down the trail, swallowing lumps of frigid air and then forcing them back out, the breeze like glass against my gums. Behind me, I could hear them. Thuds raking the snow. Heavy, hurried gallops. Shrieks of metallic joints were never meant for movement. I felt the impulse to look back, actually to see them coming for me, but instead kept my teary eyes forward. Just ahead, I could see the trail completing its loop back to the park, ending the Whimsy Way trek. I pushed towards it, bypassing a glittery mesh of gift boxes stacked up to the heavens in a holly-jolly pyramid. A gray cat sculpture was peeking out from beneath one of the bows, its slit eyes following me as I passed by. My foot found an icy patch. I shambled forward, kicking up grit and bullets of snow, fortunately recovering without a nosedive. The screeches were closer than ever, deafening to a wild chatter between my ears. At any moment, I would feel the instant force of antlers ripping through my sternum or the agony of serrated teeth finally sampling my hip. When the wrought iron arch finally became visible, I broke for it with the last stockpile of strength I had left. My legs did as they were told, pounding through the exhaustion in a mad hope for survival. I was never a runner in life, but at that moment, I swear, I could have sprinted with the best of them. The earth shook beneath me as the shrieks of tormented metal mounted up to an utter thrill of feral, murderous pressure. Then, as I flailed desperately through the gate, the world went completely quiet. My lungs were burning. My heart was pounding in strenuous disagreement. I fell to my knees, holding back the urge to vomit while also peering back down the way. Nothing was coming. No hordes of hellish iron reindeer or anything else tearing through the brush. But there was something I did see out there. Although the pursuit had stopped, the dark presence that chased me all this way had remained, currently standing on the trail. A tall, shadowy figure, rippling like smoke out of a chimney. It was watching me, a dark blotch over cursed snow. Its blackness was so thick, it could only leave the suggestion of a greatly shaggy head. Shaky breaths puffed out of me. I squinted my eyes, trying to piece together the twitching, murky thing. From within the roiling darkness, I could barely make out the faint glows of white, writhing dully in the place eyes should have been. My gasp of breath brought me out of it, and when I blinked again, the thing was gone, leaving me there to shiver and stare. I no longer work as a security guard for Slaytown, and justly. I never plan to be anywhere near it again. Who knows if the future holds the love of my life and maybe 1 or 2 kids. But if it does, it means old Dad will never bring them to see the stunning sculptures or ride the happy carriage. At least, not in that place. Never in that place. All the while, I'm sure the park will continue its copious bleeding until one day it goes terminal and a struggling owner ceases to keep their dream alive. Maybe to be sold off and renovated by new management, or maybe left behind as the permafrost sets in. Whatever happens to it, I am sure what I saw will still be there, festering like the mold beneath the workshop, endlessly waning that cold Christmas silence.
tales for dark nights.